1 minute.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news and events across our country, as well as across the fragmented surface of our globe. In the Independent Corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, first things first, let's get into the headlines this morning. In COVID news, at least 4,142 new coronavirus deaths and 190,630 new cases were reported in the United States on January 21st. That's yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 188,110 cases per day, a decrease of 21% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 24,688,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and at least 410,336 people have died from it. President Joe Biden plans to sign 2 executive orders Friday, including expanding food stamps and beginning the process to require that everyone working for the federal government get a minimum wage of $15 an hour. National Economic Council Director Brian Deese said the orders, which add to a slew Biden has already approved, are, quote, not a substitute, end quote, for the massive $1.9 trillion COVID-19 relief bill that Biden hopes Congress will pass, but rather a critical lifeline for millions of Americans who need assistance now. Amazon Inc. said on Thursday it will open a pop-up clinic in its Seattle headquarters on January 24th with an aim to vaccinate 2,000 eligible members of the public against COVID-19 on the first day. And nearly 2,000 doses of Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine were spilled at a Boston area, Virginia, a VA facility, Veterans Administration facility, after a cleaning contractor accidentally loosened a plug for a freezer. He added that he does not think that the spoiled doses will affect the vaccine rollout and told the newspaper that replacement doses were already being delivered. Moderna COVID-19 vaccines, as well as doses developed by rival Pfizer-BioNTech, must be stored at very low temperatures between -13 and -5 degrees Fahrenheit. Jamarl, let's go back to the Biden $15 minimum wage thing for federal government employees. What's your take on that?
It's good. I mean, it's very good. I think Biden's argument is basically he needs legislation before he can raise it to $15 an hour. But within the context of his purview and within his powers, this is what he's saying he could do. Look, anything or most things that Democrats do are just a modicum of difference from Republicans. And that modicum of difference is the thing that they triumphalize. This is the greatest thing ever in, incrementalism, all hail God of incrementalism. But I am unsure on Biden's executive authority to just increase the minimum wage by himself. So he could be right in the sense that, look, within the context of the powers that I have at my disposal, this is what I can do. What he is wrong about and what he is not being honest about is the student loans. That is within his purview. And that is within his powers. And by the way, not just past the 1.9 trillion. Biden, if he's going to make that argument that, hey, this is all I can do, these are within the scope of my powers, but I need Congress to pass my legislation. Okay, fair enough. By the same token, you can't lean on Republicans if they don't buy your legislation. Meaning, you can't take the excuse of, I need Congress to pass my 1.9 trillion if you're not going to maximize your executive order, your powers through executive order. And if you're going to use the excuse that I need to work with Republicans and Republicans don't work with you, then you can't use that as an excuse. Meaning, if you're going to say, I want you guys to pass my 1.9 trillion and you're willing to push your own party, because at this point, that's all you need. Get Joe Manchin online and you pass your policy. I guess I don't want Biden to be leaning on Republicans saying, well, if you guys pass my 1.9 trillion, we can get $15 an hour minimum wage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, he's dependent upon Republicans who would never do it. That's the gimmick in a game that I don't want played. And we'll see that very shortly. Biden has already said he wants to work with Republicans. And Republicans, I don't believe for one moment, are going to pass $15 an hour minimum wage. So we'll see. I could be wrong. I'm doubtful that I am, though.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see about that. Certainly, if that happens, that will hopefully be a big topic of conversation. If it doesn't come to pass, then, well, there might be more than a modicum of difference between the two parties. If Biden's able to get this through, and the Republicans aren't able to stop it. But we'll come back to that a little bit down the line. And anyway, in national political news, Kentucky Republican Mitch McConnell has pushed back against Joe Biden's first executive moves right here, slamming them as showing the Democrat president to be already headed in the wrong direction, quote unquote. He tweeted yesterday saying, quote, the failed Paris deal will hurt American families while China and Russia grow emissions. The Keystone cancellation will kill union jobs and hurt U.S. energy security. And a proposal to gut immigration enforcement and give blanket amnesty, rough day one for American workers, end quote. Internationally, the Kremlin on Friday welcomed U.S. President Joe Biden's proposal to extend the last remaining nuclear arms control treaty between the two countries, which is set to expire in less than 2 weeks. Russian President Vladimir Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that Russia stands for extending the pact and is waiting to see the details from the U.S. group. Iran's oil minister announced today that the country has seen a record high in oil exports despite U.S. sanctions on its energy sector. The oil minister Bijan Zanganeh said our, quote, enemies wanted to zero out our oil sales, but our selfless partners let us beat petroleum export records during the sanctions period, end quote. And Iran's Tasnim news agency has tweeted a doctored image of Donald Trump playing golf in the shadow of an American B-2 strategic stealth bomber. The tweet reads, quote unquote, revenge is inevitable. The quote apparently taken from a remark made by Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in December when he vowed to avenge the life of top military commander General Qasem Soleimani. The office of French president...
Wait.
Yes.
Before you go back to that, how?
Go for it.
How? There's two really interesting parts. The immigration part in and of itself is interesting. The one where basically Biden is arguing that if he increases the rate to $15 an hour minimum wage, then that will offset bringing in and opening up the immigration thing. That's his argument. On the other part, for the Iranian thing, my question is how? I keep asking this. Donald Trump is leaving office. Now, is Iran looking at the United States as the United States of America, or is he looking at it as the government by Trump? And if it is indeed the United States of America, are you going to do something under the Biden administration to respond, or are you going to look at the Biden administration as a new day? And if you do respond under Biden, what is Biden to do? This is why what Trump was doing at the last days in office is significant. If you create a situation where the country has to respond under a Biden administration, you've basically ruined any relationship between Iran and the United States if Joe Biden wanted to go back to the Iran deal. So this is the consequences of basically Trump and Israel's actions.
Well, yeah. And I mean, and the very simple appraisal would be America is America. If America does something under one presidency, America is effectively the same country under the next presidency, and you can effectively respond to it as if it were basically the same country. In other words, our decisions stick with us. You know, if moral culpability were removed from the executive branch every time you had a new president, then in some sense, you couldn't maintain diplomatic relations. It would be every time it would be a tabula rasa. It would be a complete blank slate, fresh restart. That obviously is not the case. And I'm it's a reductio ad absurdum in some sense for me to even use that as an example. But I think it holds. Now, is that fair? Or what's, how morally culpable would a Biden administration be for what a Trump administration did? I don't know, man. Is it 80%? Is it 60%? Is it 30%? Is it 99%? I don't know. But does that make sense, Jamarl?
Yeah, it does make sense. I guess what I'm saying is, what I'm getting at, it depends on the Iranian perspective. Is the Iranian perspective that, look, we're willing to take the hit under Trump because we want to have some level of ties with Biden? Because you could make an economic argument that, oh, God, we don't want to do that. The United States is the United States. The country is culpable, et cetera. By the same token, you have certain economic needs that you might want to get across in your country. Meaning you can weigh that and come away with a balance of, all right, the economic needs matter more. You could do that. By the same token, you could also say there needs to be revenge for Soleimani. And you wait until you get the opportunity for revenge. And by the way, that can be subversive. It doesn't have to be overt. So, but is it really over revenge if it's not overt? Meaning, if your public doesn't know you took revenge, is it really revenge? Yeah, this stuff gets murky.
That's exactly when you bring up the public there. That's exactly where my mind went. Inside party members in Iran might be more content with some sort of more subversive response, whatever that looks like. Whether that's economic or political, whatever it is, but. Unless there's some sort of a direct military strike or some sort of direct diplomatic détente where the United States either apologizes or is forced to make concessions, then the Iranian public is not going to feel like, that revenge was ever found. I'm not somebody who's exactly in favor is a vengefulness as like a primary emotion, but so it's just pointing it out. It's interesting to be talking about this, but so from their perspective. It's obviously what the public wants, and then there are, their sort of game theoretic needs as a party that can't make concession after concession after concession after America has acted more and more volatilely as the years have gone on. Anyway, we got more headlines to go through here, but interesting back and forth there. The office of French President Emmanuel Macron said on Thursday there would be "quote unquote" no repentance nor apologies for the French's 132 years of colonial rule over Algeria. Instead, Macron will take part in several "quote unquote" symbolic acts aiming to smooth over lasting enmity from the period, which included racial apartheid, nuclear weapons tests, and ended in a brutal war of independence that forced France from the country in 1962. The number of deaths in armed violence in the Sudanese city of Al Junaina, the capital of the West Darfur state, has risen to 83. The violence broke out on Saturday after one person had been killed in a skirmish at a local camp for displaced people. The Central African Republic has declared a 15-day state of emergency throughout the country as a coalition of armed groups seek to overthrow the newly re-elected president Faustin Archange Touadéra. Moving to tech news, Google and Facebook said they might have to stop offering some of their services in Australia if a new law which compels companies to negotiate payments to media for their content goes ahead. The legislation in question is the Digital Platforms Mandatory Bargaining Code Bill, which establishes a mandatory code of conduct, which it says should address, quote, bargaining power imbalances between digital platforms, end quote. According to the bill, digital platforms and news media businesses would be incentivized to reach agreements on payments for news content on the aforementioned platform services. Google said on Friday that it would not be viable for the company to continue offering its search engine in Australia if the code gets the green light.
Honestly, not just
federal
Google.
Judge today.
What search company is going to do that? Think about it for a moment. What search company is going to do that? That means Google. That means us, maybe. Meaning, if you have a YouTube show that you might have to come to some kind of agreement or some kind of payment for news, that's horrendous. But keep going. I'm sorry. You have more headlines.
It is certainly not the status quo. And yeah, it does sound bad from the tech company's perspective. It sounds like that would add a bunch of money to the system. But from the Australian government's perspective, you're trying to keep sort of your diverse media ecosystem alive. You're trying to keep news functionally alive and stop it from being reduced to like mere clickbaitiness or whatever can, bring the most people in to get the most eyes on ads, potentially. So, there are arguments to be made on that side, but I think that you're right. I don't see the other players who are having to pay for that content being at all satisfied with this going forward, and therefore there are legitimate questions about whether it's going to go through. In our next headline, a federal judge today rejected Parler's motion for a preliminary injunction against Amazon Web Services, scuttling the social network's attempt to quickly get back onto Amazon's web hosting platform. Parler accused Amazon of conspiracy and restraint of trade in violation of the Sherman Act, breach of contract, and tortious interference with business expectancy. Judge Rothstein wrote that, quote, AWS disputes all three claims, asserting that it is Parler, not AWS, that has violated the terms of the parties' agreement, and in particular, AWS's acceptable use policy, which prohibits the quote-unquote illegal, harmful, or offensive use of AWS services, end quote. In our last headline here, in Earth and Science News, Elon Musk said yesterday via a tweet that he will donate $100 million, would be his largest philanthropic effort yet, toward a prize for the best carbon capture technology. The broad definition of carbon capture and storage is about, as the name implies, waste carbon dioxide emitted at a refinery or factory is stored in an aim to remove the potential harmful byproduct from the environment and mitigate climate change. It is not a new pursuit. Numerous companies have popped up over the past couple of decades with varying means of achieving the same end goal. And if I'm not incorrect, I think we've actually talked about this on the show before with environmentalist guests. Guy McPherson. I think we've had that conversation with him before. It's been a while, but different kinds of carbon capture technologies. We were talking about whether or not he saw those coming to pass, how effective he thought they would be. Anyway, we got to cut out the headlines here. You guys have been listening to Headlines on Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're going into a break. We'll be back in just a minute with the soapbox segment and Jamarl Thomas's monologue. Again, you're listening to Fault Lines with my co-host Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Political Misfits. Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Yesterday, I watched a miraculous, astonishing press conference by Nancy Pelosi. Astonishing for the level of hypocrisy that was built into the press conference. It seems as if mainstream media, I point this out all the time, have a memory of about 5 years. And oftentimes things happen that are breathtaking in their scale and causes you to ask questions as to why. How does one reconcile one belief with the other belief, seeing as these two things seem to contradict each other? It's a small club, you ain't in it. And I've made this argument before that this is a uni party. This is one party. And the way Pelosi, and the speech that Pelosi gave yesterday kind of gets that across, that Donald Trump is not a part of that club. I've said that before. McConnell didn't necessarily like him. Many of the Republicans didn't necessarily like him. I don't believe they'll impeach him, though, because at the end of the day, Donald Trump is still a political force. He's a gravity unto himself. And regardless of the Republican Party trying to get rid of him, he is the ego of that party. I would argue he is the populist aspect of that party, despite the fact that at the end of it all, Trump was just a Republican. But to focus on Pelosi for a moment, I've made the argument that selective justice is not justice. Now, I've made that argument, especially going back to the last impeachment. There were a lot of people who thought Trump should be impeached. But I made the point that how are you going to impeach Trump for the behavior that Joe Biden basically stood on stage and screamed about? And you guys were okay with Joe Biden doing it, so how are you all of a sudden okay or against Trump? He wasn't a part of that club, despite the fact that Trump was rich. For whatever particular reason, Donald Trump didn't get membership. Donald Trump's strength and his power in politics was basically his support. And he was able to use that support and wield that support against his political foes, even cowing people who were political foes but didn't have the courage to say anything about it. I think the left needs to pay attention to that. More importantly, back on Pelosi for a moment. Pelosi, press conference, she says, I don't think it's very unifying to say, let's just forget it and move on. She's talking about impeachment, meaning the impeachment proceeding against Trump are going to move forward. And this is going to move into the Senate. And again, the question is whether or not they're going to do it. I don't necessarily think they are, but there are going to be many Republicans that will vote to impeach Trump now that he has been depowered, the Black Panther losing its serum. And he has a lot of enemies that are out to get him now. Pelosi, I don't think it's very unifying to say, let's forget it and move on. Nancy Pelosi said Thursday about the intention to send articles of impeachment against the former president, Donald Trump. She continues on this. She says, right here, there's no question that there were members of the body who gave aid and comfort to those with the idea that they were embracing a lie perpetuated by the President of the United States, and that the election did not have legitimacy. Pelosi, on if she had evidence the GOP members gave insurrection tours. Here's the problem with this. Nancy Pelosi, when George Bush was in office, she said she knew George Bush was lying, but thought that impeachment was divisive. Man, how a few years make a difference in the perspective of the person who's in office, especially when that person is Donald Trump. It's astonishing. If you thought that George Bush was lying, if you knew George Bush was lying, if you believe that the torture regime was okay, if you believe that the mass surveillance was okay, by the way, both of those broke the law. And yeah, the invasion of a country on the premise of a lie that got, 4,000 Americans killed, 1 million Iraqis, and spent $7 trillion in blood and treasure or in a treasure. But Pelosi could not be bothered to bring it for an impeachment vote. This is the point that I'm trying to make. Why was Bush spared, but Trump is not going to be spared? I hope you understand the point that I'm making. Bush gets 1 million people killed. And yet, that doesn't rise to the level of impeachment. That's like Mike Tyson biting off the ear of the other boxer of Holyfield, and yet they're like, all right, we're just going to fine you. If that doesn't get you thrown out of boxing, what does? It's kind of the same premise here. If you allow a president to do that, then you basically implicitly make that policy. You implicitly allow the next future presidents to take that exact same behavior as they move forward. So I'm stuck with this position that when Pelosi tries to impeach Trump the first time around, my response is selective justice is not justice. You're selectively using the political instrument to go after your political opponents. The political instrument is not there for that. If your political opponent does something foul, fair enough, by the same token, you can't give your guy a pass that's part of your political party, but go after the other guy, using the political instrument to do so for something that your guy also did. Selective justice is not justice. This is the issue for Brazil, right? You have the situation where they have Operation Car Wash, and all of these people in Congress or in the parliament is like guilty as sin. There's cases on pretty much all of these people. And yet, what do? They go after Rousseff. They go after Oh, I can't think of his name. I can see his face. But you get my point. They make these policies that basically it'll come to me. They use a political instrument to go after the workers' parties and the people who are part of the workers' party, while the same token giving a pass to others. I'm making the point that the same thing was true in the first impeachment. And how does that line up against a previous president when you know he lied, cheated, and stole? Meaning, invaded a country, got millions of people killed. We're still in those wars to this day, tortured, which is against our laws. And again, mass surveillance, which was against our laws. And Pelosi didn't think that rose to the level of impeachment, but this does. And to go so far as to say there's no question that members of this body gave comfort to those with the idea that they were embracing a lie perpetuated by the POTUS, their weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, is a larger or just as large of a lie. My issue here with this, though, in saying selective justice is not justice, and still coming to the conclusion that Donald Trump should be impeached, is this notion of insurrection. It's one thing to say that the President of the United States, or let's say George Bush, did something that she gave a pass for, and that Joe Biden did something that she was going to give a pass for. But insurrection is something that nobody else touches. That is a hot rail. And that is a hot rail because that hot rail is the destruction of the Union. That is the path that unravels this country. When you get to the point where you lose credibility in media, which we have, you lose credibility in politicians, which we have, and the institutions and whatnot have not necessarily, let's say, attended to the best interests of the American public and whatnot. And so you have this huge number of the public that gets alienated from the political device. And you get a politician that gets angry because they delegitimize his election. Now, the honest case is Donald Trump might have taken this tact, whether or not they pull the Russiagate stuff out of the way. Meaning, the Russiagate stuff could be an excuse that Donald Trump is using to not accept the fact that he basically lost this race, and that the communists working with the ghosts of Hugo Chavez, working with Kemp, and the Chinese giving approval wasn't the thing that lost him this race. How does a man have 300,000 deaths on his back in regards to a race and then considers that the race was stolen? No. The difference here is between the first impeachment and this one is that many of the politicians, Republicans included, consider this aspect of politics a hot rail. And they understand that going after the notion of the credibility, even if the elections have problems, that undermines the country. That creates the precipice or the pretext for some kind of civil conflict with millions not believing that the person who won the election is the legitimate winner. Our body of politics is dependent upon this notion that the public chooses, that the legitimacy is conferred by the public's will. What happens when you get millions of people in the public that no longer believes that the public chose and that the elections themselves are fraudulent? This is what Donald Trump pushed. This is what Donald Trump endeared. And on top of that, people in Congress, meaning Pelosi and some of the other Republicans who are often in a bubble, and often, $300 million Pelosi under normal circumstances doesn't have to get her blood pressure up for anything. Their blood pressure got up for this when they had to run to a safe room. Meaning the mob directly went after politics or the politicians, which they are not going to get con-left. Beyond that point, though, for me, this boils down to this notion that even though selective justice is not justice, I have great qualms with presidents of the United States going about this route of inciting this kind of insurrection and pushing back. I don't have an issue with a politician challenging the election results. I have an issue with the way Trump went about it. This open mouth coup that he tried to prosper over the American public in broad daylight. There is a problem with that. I don't have issue, again, with the challenging of the election. I have the issue with Donald Trump didn't have a pot to piss in and a window to throw it out of. Impeachment, to me, is valid. I have no issue with them going through with it. And no, I don't think he should get a pardon. Shane, what do you think? Should Donald Trump get a pardon from Joe Biden against impeachment?
I don't think Biden would do himself any political favors to do that. So that's first up. I don't think that these are impeachable offenses. I've changed my mind on this. I think they come close, but I don't think that Trump actually tried to incite insurrection. I just think he sort of casually sauntered by as insurrection, as insurrection basically did what he wanted. But I don't remember him calling for violence at any point, and I don't remember him calling for any rebellion against the government, other than the de facto one, which is him contesting the election results. But again, presidents are allowed to do that. One other point on this. I know we don't have much time to have this back and forth, but and maybe we should just go into our next guest.
No,
but
make your
the
point.
thing is,
you have about 30. Make your point.
Yeah. The thing is, the public had already lost faith in our voting systems. It's not like, yes, Trump did push them, and so I can make an argument for either side. Either that Trump incited a public that was ready to disbelieve in the outcome of our elections, or that the public already didn't believe in our electoral process, and Trump probably increased the numbers of folks who didn't believe it. He certainly allowed them to rally around him. But either way, as we've talked about many times on the show, our electoral system lacks transparency. It has a history of fraud, and therefore it lacks credibility. And that's just waiting to happen in some sense. A Democrat, given practically any election, could also have a right to contest that election, not just because they intrinsically have a right to do so, but because there are problems with our electoral system. Now, that doesn't mean that I think that this election was thrown in Biden's favor. I don't. We still need to have more conversations on that, I think, and hopefully we'll be gosh darned allowed to have them in the current media and social media environment. But yeah, that's sort of my take on this. We don't have too much time for it right now. Obviously, more to talk about here as the impeachment process rolls forward. They will probably, I don't know if they'll do it, but it probably won't be restricted by the mere facts if there's, a political calculus that balances out in favor of impeachment. But we need to go into a break. Talk more to talk about later, certainly. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in just a minute with our next guest, Brad Blankenship.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to cash them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is Prague-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter whose column can be found on RT and CGTN.com. Bradley Blankenship. Bradley, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us.
Hey guys, how's it going there in Washington these days?
It is chaotic. Let's say it that way. I mean, outside of the Capitol riots, we also had this basically martial law. Joe Biden was basically inaugurated with more 25,000 troops compared to like 1,000 people. So it is very bizarre, very weird. Add in the COVID stuff, it is a very, very weird time to be in America. Everybody has on masks.
I will put it like this. I'm very happy to be halfway across the country in South Dakota right now on my winter retreat or whatever I want to call this, because it is chaotic in Washington. You've seen the pictures, Brad, I'm sure. Not just what happened a couple of weeks ago, but this Wednesday. It's crazy, man. Yeah,
it's very bizarre, Brad. Well, that brings us to the issue with China, Prague-based. So, like you said, you're kind of away from this. But before we get into some of the topics on the Chinese sanctions and whatnot that they've placed on Trump officials, I want to get into something else that's a little different, or a little bit, I guess, is an evergreen story. I look at politics, and I look at I've started to look at politics as power centers. Not necessarily that anything necessarily has any God-given cosmic authority in this sense. But you had a time where it was the church. You had a time where it was the political space. You had a time where it was the king. And you get into this kind of weird time of the corporate power structure of sorts. And China is an interesting case because it's a communist country, and yet they've been able to lasso capitalism to try to get the best bang for the buck without necessarily releasing it over to the capitalist class to basically co-opt and take or capture the government. This is quite amazing to me. Now, my question for stuff like that is, are they not concerned that that power center will be able to basically have a coup in its own right? Meaning the money, the resources that they have at their disposal by creating a class of people with super wealth, which is what they have in China. I mean, they have like the differential in wealth disparity. And so while the Communist Party is in control of it and keeping power in the government itself now, are they not concerned that that power center of wealth would be able to, let's say, overcome this notion of the Communist Party taking over the government? What's the analysis of that from the standpoint of the communist government and being able to keep and maintain power?
Well, the Communist Party of China said since Deng Xiaoping was in power that they were aware that allowing this controlled liberalization would create what they called capitalist decadence in Chinese society. But Deng Xiaoping said that they were not afraid of it because of the leadership of the Communist Party of China. Of course, the communists in China are always monitoring these situations and always, they're very keenly aware of the fact that there is could be, for example, CIA intelligence influence through these people, which there was for quite some time in China, even in the Communist Party, until Xi Jinping took power and went on his anti-corruption spree. Chinese civil society pushes back against the wealthy. Sometimes you'll see there's like names of billionaires published publicly, shaming them for their exuberant wealth. There's kids of billionaires that, like trust fund kids that are chastised in the media and in civil society in China. But I think what's really interesting, the richest man in China, Jack Ma, he hadn't been seen in public for several months. And his first public appearance that he had recently was a speech to, I think it was a rural educators group. So it's not as if he had met personally with Xi Jinping or with some Communist Party officials or Chinese government officials. But apparently $54 million in China gets you this kind of meeting, which tells you, I think, a lot about what kind of access wealth gets you in China, which is to say not really that much, actually.
Can you go a bit more deeply into what capitalist decadence looks like? That is a standout phrase. I'm just curious from the CCP's perspective.
Capitalist decadence is like what you're seeing it's like what you're seeing in Hong Kong. For example, like the runaway housing market in Hong Kong that's creating. I don't know if you guys ever seen the Vice News documentary, but about people living in cages in Hong Kong. I mean, it's created pretty incredible amount of inequality in Hong Kong, which is largely the kind of current underneath the movements that was supported by Washington, the Hong Kong independence movement or whatever was going on there. This inequality created the situation from which the capitalist decadent, organized bourgeois democratic movement started, right? So that's what they were always trying to be aware of, is when you create these vast wells of inequality, you create situations where, insurrection or foreign-backed movements can emerge, which is what happened in Hong Kong.
Well, and you know what? I don't mean to pat ourselves on the back on this from the standpoint of this network, but we were, this network covered Hong Kong, and we went further into the idea that these guys were just pro-democracy. You know what I mean? Like, if I'm not mistaken, even RT, we were doing, the coverage on this was actually quite good. I think we had people there, if I'm not mistaken. But the whole point was we were getting into this point that, yeah, you're right. It seemed to be an issue of inequality. And the inequality issue was basically covered by the Western media as pro-democracy. It's fascinating the way that works, right? Okay, so that's fair. That makes sense. That basically it's a situation that they're looking at as you have to kind of balance some of this stuff, where the thought is, yes, we're going to maintain power. By the same token, we're going to put a lasso around capitalism and use it for our ends in order to expand. What are they expecting from a Biden presidency? I know that some people have made the argument that the reason that Trump had such a difficult time with, let's say, China or whatever, had to do with Trump didn't have a relationship in that way with China. That even though Biden under the Obama administration, both of these guys were going for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was a way to the Asian pivot, as they call it, and putting military armaments in that part of the world, that basically Biden had more or has more of a relationship with China, and that is more smoothed out. Do you buy that? Like, do you buy that argument that Biden will have a better relationship with China than Trump? Or that basically, like we were talking about before, U.S. policy is U.S. policy, and while it may change depending upon the president in the overt sense, that basically the underlying modus operandi remains. It considers China a threat because of its ability to basically expand, because of its economic capabilities, and as such, regardless of the president, they will take action to try to cow that. So how do you see that? What do you think the Biden administration is going to, the policy of the Biden administration, do you think it's going to be drastically different than Trump?
Well, I don't. I think it really, in this regard, U.S. policy is U.S. policy, and it's been for quite some time. I think that the United States started to recognize the reality of China's rise at the beginning of the 21st century. I would say probably under Bush, when the United States went into Afghanistan, which was really, and this is kind of openly admitted by former State Department officials. I think Colin Powell's former spokesperson or somebody working in his State Department had openly admitted that the war in Afghanistan largely was an effort to contain China, to be able to run interference using the CIA in Xinjiang, also potentially being able to break up the Belt and Road Initiative and so on. And so this is why Biden doesn't want to leave Afghanistan, because the United States needs a large military presence there on China's border. In terms of what Trump did, though, that was such a break, I think that these are things like what Trump did, they had basically violated the one China policy, recognizing Taiwan as an independent government, even though it is technically part of China. And this is the policy of virtually every single United Nations member in the world, every member state of the United Nations, supporting the Hong Kong independence movement, the recent bills that interfere in Tibet, and basically just trying to sow division all over China. These are things I think that the United States wanted to do, but not just in 1 year or 2 years. This would have been a protracted policy. So in terms of what Biden's going to do, I think he's probably going to do the exact same thing, but just more drawn out and more tactful, and not so blatantly inflammatory. Because of course, China is obviously an important country, and they are building their own coalition in the global South to create their own narrative about what's going on, and to really expose the blatant interference by the United States. And I think you can already see this by the Biden administration's reaction to the sanctions that were laid on former Trump officials. They had called this an escalation, and instead of turning the page and saying, okay, yeah, you sanction these Trump officials, what they did was kind of messed up to China in terms of engaging in interference and trying to damage Chinese national security. Instead of the olive branch to China, they put an olive branch to the Republicans, and basically said that we want to do bipartisan U.S. imperialism, as we have been doing for generations before that.
It's something worth bringing up here. Antony Blinken, Biden's nominee for Secretary of State, and it appears that he will become the Secretary of State. I'm pretty sure his nomination will go through. Has on Tuesday supported Mike Pompeo and Trump's policies against China, specifically on Tuesday, after Pompeo, the State Department, the U.S. government, labeled China a country committing genocide against the Uyghurs. Blinken said he thought that was the right move. And just generally, on Tuesday, he said that he thought that Trump was right to take a tougher approach to China. So all appearances are that the chief foreign policy czar for the U.S. coming in is going to continue that trend. I'm curious. We only have a minute, and so what I think I'm going to do is take us to an early break. But when we come back, Brad, I want to check with you. What is China's status as a sort of manufacturing / increasingly developing and almost, I don't know exactly how you straddle the line between developing and developed as this sort of dichotomy of world, economic factor for a country. But, for a long time, China has had a sort of perceived subservient relationship to other more developed countries, specifically as a major manufacturer, as a major industrial center. I'm curious, I want to check with you when we come back about where they are now, because if they move to not just, not just to a manufacturing base, but through the Belt and Road Initiative, through the RCEP, to a major hub and a major world leader, that, of course, is a large part of their sort of arc or trajectory as a growing power internationally. So I wanted to do a check-in with you about where they are on that arc. But we'll come back on that. We are joined by Brad Blankenship. He is a Prague-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter whose column can be found on RT and CGTN.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by our guest, Brad Blankenship, Prague-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter whose column can be found on RT and CGTN.com. Brad, as we went into the break, I kind of stumblingly stated and asked a question. I stated a set of affairs, and then I asked what you thought, where we were within that set of affairs. Basically, China as a rising power, moving from merely a manufacturing center with a massive population to a world hub for trade and a financial leader in the world. How far along that are they? Do you admit to, is that the right sort of way to portray their growth and a state of affairs? And if so, where are they on that route, Brad?
Yeah, so this year, China's unveiled a lot of new policies, for example, like the dual circulation, that they want to, really internationalize Chinese tech. China is leading the world in innovation in many different fronts. This year, actually, Shanghai had the most IPOs of any financial center in the world. And there is definitely a lot of foreign capital investment in China now. And in fact, China is about to release the digital yuan soon. So there's a lot of exciting things happening. Of course, China's already the second largest economy, and we learned this year that new estimates suggest that by the end of the decade, it will be the largest. So, of course, China is a very powerful and important country. But actually, the Chinese government, less than 2 weeks ago, issued a white paper called China's International Development Cooperation in the New Era that actually really, I think, shows how China perceives itself now. And there's a lot of discussion about South-South cooperation that China wants to engage with, for example, in Africa and other countries in Asia and South America. And it was really apparent to me reading that China understands, or at least sees itself as still a developing country. And actually, the Communist Party and Chinese government officials talk about this all the time. They note the fact that GDP per capita in China is still quite low. China has massive GDP, but it's a huge country with a lot of people, and the GDP per capita is quite small. And, we are seeing this really prolific rise of China and explosive economic growth. China is the only major world economy this year to experience any economic growth. It had a really strong second half of 2020. But if we look at it and think of it this way, China wants to become a prosperous, democratic, moderately prosperous socialist country by 2049, which is the 100-year anniversary of the People's Republic of China. If they were to have GDP per capita on parity with, for example, the United States, the total GDP of China would be about the same size as total global GDP right now this year. So in this sense, China's economic growth has not actually even begun. They're still very much along that path, even though they are already the second largest economy in the world.
Bradley, I think the thing that concerns me is this, what it seems to be developing is this kind of two-axis world. And, China has every right to develop. It is every bit as much as every other country has a right to develop. Do they recognize, like, for example, the U.S. took a policy that basically said we are not going to allow another rival similar to the Soviet Union in regards to its scope and scale and ability to have this kind of major peer-to-peer conflict. But fact of the matter is that positions your country into perpetual conflict, perpetual war, especially when engaging with something like China. Now, I don't believe that the original basis of this is a war, but I do believe it's this kind of economic war of sorts, where the U.S. and people within the U.S. recognize that China, with 4 or 5 times our population, that if they're able to, like you said, actualize the level of technical acumen and increase the level of prosperity in the nation, that they're going to be a powerhouse by definition. Do they recognize that military is an aspect of that, meaning protecting the investments across the world? Because, like you said, if the
of course.
Yeah, well, that gets to the whole two-axis thing, though. What is their policy, or what is their plan to be able to mitigate some of the threats that are posed, let's say, by Western powers that don't necessarily want to release the differential and advantage, be it military or economic?
Well, in terms of what we see as the West, I don't think that this whole Cold War scenario is going to happen again. Actually, the European Union is really steadfast on what they call strategic autonomy. And for example, the EU just signed the comprehensive agreement on investments with China that actually we had discussed a few months ago. They signed that right at the end of last year. And of course, the Biden administration is not too happy about this. But it's really creating a situation, the three largest economies right now, which is China, the European Union, and the United States. It's not the EU and the United States versus China. In fact, it's just everybody kind of independent. And it's less a bipolar world now and more of a multipolar world.
And we haven't even brought in Russia. So there would be at least sort of 4 major centers of power. And then if China, not to mention other countries, are trying to stimulate growth in Africa and South America. I want to come back to that. You're talking about, they're sometimes referred to as the global South, Africa and South America. It seems like China, as a major trade power, would be extending its influence across the Indian Ocean, as well as the South Pacific, if not the whole of the Pacific, pretty quickly through that process. And that would be happening over the next couple of decades. A bunch of different directions we could go in at this point. I'm curious, though, specifically in the Pacific, there are already sort of major simmering disputes over the South China Sea, over the Spratly Islands, and the region in general, between mainly the United States and China. How is, just from a sort of high-level view, what should we be watching out for over the next couple of years and the next couple of decades as China attempts to increase its influence and as the United States doubles down and tries to combat, I'm guessing at every turn, that growth? What should we be watching out for? What conflicts do you think are going to increase? Is there anything that we might not be seeing now that might come back to the fore? Just generally, what do you think is going to happen, Brad?
Well, one of the biggest things that's really been happening there is basically the United States had been nudging, for example, the Philippines to escalate with China on this matter, to go to the floor of the United Nations and bring resolutions against China, or before the International Court of Justice, so on. The Philippines actually, President Duterte has backed off of this approach, and he said in his State of the Union address a few months ago that basically he didn't want to escalate with China because he understood that it would be a war with China. And instead, actually, China recently announced that it would donate 500,000 COVID vaccines to the Philippines. And in fact, Duterte and Xi Jinping had been in close communication this entire time about cooperation on the COVID-19 pandemic, because of course the Philippines has one of the worst outbreaks in Asia. I think that you're seeing that situation in terms of the parties that are actually involved, meaning the countries that actually are there. You know, the United States. It's really, to me, bizarre that the United States has so much at play. I mean, I understand why, but I mean, it's just hilarious that it's called the South China Sea, and the United States is like one of the biggest parties in this dispute. Of course, there's obvious reasons for that, but it's just like on its face, really absurd to me. And all of the people, you know, the people that actually live there, the parties involved, the countries that actually exist there, you know, not 4,000 miles away in Washington, D.C., I think they're really simmering on this issue because they realize, you know, it's one that is being propped up by outside influencers that want to have, you know, this stranglehold on international trade, because of course that's a huge corridor in oceanic trade, and there's trillions of dollars every year that go through there. So of course the United States has an interest. So I think on that particular issue, personally, I see it simmering down because the escalation there requires consent from countries in the United States' access there. But everywhere the United States has any influence, that influence is being drawn down. It's being undermined by Washington itself. I mean, that's why the Europeans have strategic autonomy, because they realize they can't trust Americans. In fact, there was a poll recently that said basically 1 in 3 Europeans does not trust Americans after the election of Donald Trump.
I mean, how could you, you know, like, I don't necessarily think they're insane on that point. I mean, Donald Trump was the ghost rider. I mean, he like ripped off the flaming skull. That is basically the way we do our politics. I mean, it was phenomenal. I mean, he put sanctions on EU, which is supposed to be friends of ours. I guess this is why I say a dual axis world. Because I guess my thought is, under Trump's guidance, many of the people around the world basically lumped together. Meaning there's an incentive for many of the countries, be it China, be it Russia, be it Iran, be it Syria, etc., to basically lump together in support of one another to push back against what you can call, you know, U.S. overreach. I mean, even the Huawei thing, where they were basically trying to get the UK to not use Chinese products. This goes beyond capitalistic competition among companies, and this goes into the government itself getting involved to give assistance. Even with the gas pipeline in Germany, where Angela Merkel is like, yeah, we're keeping the pipeline. But Angela Merkel, would she say that if Angela Merkel was staying in power? Meaning, is it one of those things where she's leaving power so she's keeping it? Are we seeing basically a waning of U.S. soft power and a rise, and basically, like you say, either multipolar or, I suspect, as it goes on further into the future, maybe a dual polar world? Is this just a decrease in soft power?
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. You said the UK, you know, banning Huawei. The United Kingdom has the worst recession of any developed country in the world right now. I mean, the country is in total turmoil. They have probably the worst coronavirus death rate in the world right now. They have just their economy's in ruin, and that's the double punch from the failed COVID response by the Tory government and also the Brexit. You know, they're facing a serious reckoning, and if they think that they can, you know, salvage their economy and their country by a trade deal with the United States that's in a really similar position, that's just hilarious. I mean, well, I shouldn't say it's funny. It's really not funny because a lot of people are going to suffer for this, but it's just not going to work. I mean, this is just not a good strategy. The United Kingdom is going to need a trade deal with China if they want to have their economy succeed. And I tell you what, the way you don't do that is banning Huawei, banning one of the top premier Chinese tech companies. So it's really a situation where even if you're ideologically opposed to China, you still have to do business with them, you know, because they're leading the world's economic recovery right now. It's just a fact.
Yeah, and you know, I think it's Britain's best interest, the UK's best interest to make deals wherever they could at this point, considering the Brexit stuff. Bradley, thank you for coming on, man. I always appreciate you coming on. Bradley Blankenship is a Prague-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter whose column can be found on RT and CGTN.com. You can follow Bradley on Twitter at Brad Blank with a, I think that's an underscore, and follow his writing on RT.com and CGTN.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system. Your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Jane Stranahan.
And that would mean you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 4,142 new COVID deaths and 190,630 new cases were reported in the United States on January 21st. Over the past week, there's been an average of 188,110 cases per day, a decrease of 21% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Friday morning, more than 24,688,100 people in the United States have been infected with the COVID coronavirus, and at least 410,336 have died from it. That number is astonishing. President Joe Biden, no longer president-elect, plans to sign 2 executive orders Friday, including expanding food stamps and beginning the process to require that everyone working for the federal government gets a minimum wage of $15 an hour. The National Economic Council Director Brian Deese said the orders, which add to a slew of Biden already approved, are, quote, not a substitute, unquote, for the massive $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief bill that Biden hopes Congress will pass, but rather a critical lifeline for millions of Americans who need assistance now. Amazon Inc. said on Thursday it will open a pop-up clinic in its Seattle headquarters on January 24th with an aim to vaccinate 2,000 eligible members of the public against coronavirus on the first day. Nearly 2,000 doses of Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine were spoiled at a Boston area VA facility after a cleaning contractor accidentally loosened the plug for a freezer. He added that he does not think the spoiled doses will affect the vaccine rollout and told the paper that the replacement doses were already being delivered. Moderna's COVID-19 vaccines, as well as doses developed by rival Pfizer-BioNTech, must be stored at very low temperatures between -13 and -5 degrees Fahrenheit. Kentucky Republican Mitch McConnell has pushed back against Joe Biden's first executive moves, slamming them as showing the Democratic president to be already headed in the, quote, wrong direction, unquote. He tweeted yesterday, quote, the failed Paris deal will hurt American families while China and Russia grow emissions. The Keystone cancellation will kill union jobs and hurt the U.S. energy security, and a proposal to gut immigration enforcement and give blank amnesty. Rough day one for American workers, unquote. This is great. McConnell once, when he was arguing against the Affordable Care Act, made the point that it doesn't even cover everybody, as if he would be for it if it covered everybody. The idea that he's arguing for unions, the Republican Party, is astonishing. Like, it's amazing. This is a guy who was basically in lockstep with Donald Trump all the way through, and he turns around and says Joe Biden is headed in the wrong direction by, paying attention to the issue of climate and our habitable environment. By the way, the Paris Accord is nowhere near sufficient, and killing the XL pipeline. Shane, what do you think about this? I mean, it's amazing. Like this gets to why credibility has been lost in politics. And I got to be honest, I think it gets to my reaction about the Stalin comment. I try to be earnest, and I try to be honest. If I get something wrong, fair enough, but I do try to come at it from an earnest spot. These guys have just say whatever. Mitch McConnell arguing for unions is hilarious. And to go further and make this point that saying the Paris deal will hurt families while China and Russia grow emissions, this is nonsense. The issues that pertain to America are here in this country. And the Keystone XL pipeline is not this massive jobs program in the way that these guys talk about. The one interesting thing here that I want to talk about is the immigration. The immigration will basically a rough day for American workers. Now, I've had conversations with people who will make the argument about immigration and say, look, this is hurting the American workers at the bottom, and it is basically allowing, let's say, people of color in low-income jobs to rival immigrants for low-income jobs. Now, the honest reality of it is the argument can be made that says, well, look, these things aren't really rivals and these things aren't competition with one another. And I could go with that argument if it wasn't for basically Biden, that administration, basically saying, well, we're trying to raise the increase or the minimum wage to $15 an hour to kind of edge off that negative potential impact of basically allowing the immigration or amnesty. What do you think about that? Because I've met Democrats who honestly believe that everybody who poses this is racist. Like anybody who says they want border control for the issue of jobs and the issue of not adversely affecting jobs for people at the low end of the income scale, they would say, oh, those people are just using that as an excuse, those people are racist, etc. But I've met people who aren't racist who make this exact same argument. What do you think about this? Is there... Ignore McConnell for the moment, because McConnell's a political actor that will say whatever. Just from an honest standpoint in regards to kind of an appraisal. Does immigration, if somebody say, hey, let's just open the borders, would that adversely affect work? And would this amnesty adversely affect jobs? I don't think so. I think this is just the excuse these guys are using. I mean, he's not giving blanket amnesty. He's basically giving amnesty for the first 100 days or something like that in regards to... no deportation for the first 100 days. Yeah, so it's
That's
not like
idea.
blanket amnesty forever. Biden basically made the point that Trump made when Trump first took office, that he was going to focus on people who were criminals or people who were a threat to our society. Trump turned around and didn't do that. He just went after everybody. So what do you think about this from the standpoint of jobs and from the standpoint of the way Biden's tenor may go with the immigration issue?
Well, first off, one thing that hasn't been said here is that we are currently in a pretty screwed up situation where there are currently many people living in the United States, either illegally or semi-illegally, who work, get paid, and are forced to live in pretty crappy conditions because they aren't provided sufficient legal protection. And so there's a sort of, it's not slave labor, but there's a de facto underpaid population, many of whom, live at or below, working on a minimum wage or below minimum wage, hour by hour, doing pretty crappy jobs, aren't treated well, and aren't really given legal representation or too many legal protections. So that's right out of the gate. That's not good for anybody. I would argue it would be better if we went in one of the other directions, and either. The problem is that as soon as I start talking about, okay, if you want to lower illegal immigration, well, you need to look at the stuff we've done to destabilize the country to our south. We need to stop, if there were a long-term, I'll put it like this, if the politicians who were called, nativists or who were called racists for wanting to lower illegal immigration were at the same time pushing to like rehabilitate our relations with Mexico, engage in some philanthropic endeavors to help the Mexican government out with their many problems, and basically shore up one of the two major countries, one of the two countries that neighbors us on our land borders, then I think they would have a lot more weight to their argument. Now, I want to come back to what you were saying. There are many on the left. In fact, as far as I can tell, this is like a classic Marxist position. If you're looking at the value of labor and what the U.S. or any given country is doing is relying on an imported labor source, well, part of what that does is, at least in the short run, that sort of artificially or naturally lowers the going cost of hiring wage labor on that sort of low to mid-skill level. That's just what it does right out the gate. Now, there are questions about in the long run what that does, and I don't think that many of the folks who are opposed to illegal immigration who are opposed to more immigration, frankly, are entirely willing to hear out. Which is, okay, in the short run that does lower wages, but in the long run that might incentivize more business, which might mean more jobs, which might be better for the economy as a whole, and that might help to raise wages. I don't know if that comes to pass because there are so many other factors, but I just wanted to throw those things into the conversation too. Frankly, I think that if we were to help out, if we were to do more to help China so that they, there wasn't this sort of remittance economy going on where a lot of folks who came into the United States were basically working in pretty crappy conditions and sending money home to their families who frankly need it, we'd be in a much better position. At the same time, like so many things, there are multiple sides to the conversation, but I think that should be priority number one. Anyway, Jamarl.
No, I think that's a good point. I guess my thought is there's a few things that adversely affect jobs, right? I mean, if we're going to allow companies to cut their labor force and ship their jobs overseas in order to make a nickel or to make $5 or $10 more, well, that also hurts jobs, right? So it's not just bringing in immigration. And yeah, I've heard, I give credence to this argument that uncontrolled immigration does adversely affect jobs. With one catch, like you said, we need to stop screwing around in other countries. Meaning, if you're going to set Bolivia on fire, if you're going to set Honduras on fire, if you're going to set, many of the countries, El Salvador, if you're going to set all of these countries on fire for decades, either with kill squads or either with coup attempts or coups, then you can't be shocked that people are going to come to your borders. You can't be shocked. You can't be shocked. That's the catch, right? It's one thing to say we're going to push for better policies in those countries. We're going to try to ensure that those countries are up to a certain standard where people would prefer to stay in their own country. That's the argument to be made. Not, let's just shut the borders and let's just stop the people from coming in. There's also a secondary question of if your country or your economic system is incapable of using human labor, then something's wrong with your economic system. Think of all the capabilities of an individual. Think of all the abilities of thought, all the abilities of action, all of the things that need to be done, the roads that need to be built, the buildings that need to be fixed, the weatherizing from the standpoint of solar power. If you cannot use the human labor and the potential of that human labor, something is wrong. Something is wrong. Meaning people coming to the country in and of itself, if your economic system was ideal, the individuals coming into the system could be utilized to make this country better. That's the point that I'm making. But oftentimes we end up with this kind of fight at the bottom where the political classes will use immigration to basically attack people at the low end of the economic scale to drag down the value of labor. So I guess it's both ways, right? I mean, an argument can be made for both. And I've heard people make the argument for both, like you said, socialists and Republicans. It's very strange. It's like how you could take basically a similar position when making completely different arguments to substantiate the position. But I don't think you can say, let's shut down the border while simultaneously taking actions and provocative actions in other countries that destabilize those countries. You can't have it both ways. The Kremlin...
And that's a foreign... I'm sorry for cutting off. We should go back to headlines. That's a foreign policy thing. And right now, sort of anti-military industrial complex, anti-MIC talking points are effectively out of the Overton window. And so, like so many other things, that keeps us in a holding pattern where, in my opinion, we're in the worst of both worlds. Anyway, Jamarl.
Yeah. And we seem to keep ending up in that position. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines on Thomas and Stranahan. The reason I think we keep ending up in the worst of both worlds, I think part of it is because our intentions, like the goal, the objectives, is often not meant for the best outcome. It's usually to preserve something else. And so in this very specific case of, like you say, it's outside the Overton window about attacking other countries. It is always outside of the Overton window for the U.S. doing things, either coups or other countries, despite the fact that it's clearly that we do. Like, this goes to this thing. I mean, there was just a report that came out where, I think it's called Edelson, that they were talking about the press and how people have lost faith and belief in the press for, at the most, ever. I think it was like 56% or something like that didn't buy into the press. I think 18% of Republicans bought into the press. Like, the numbers were abysmal. But I think it's stuff like this. Like, we're basically screaming that Juan Guaido is a leader of a country that Juan Guaido is not the leader of. We're basically arguing with, right here, rough day for American workers. He has no issue with basically using these type of arguments, despite the fact that he's not for unions, he's not for any of that stuff. It's like there's a dishonesty that is almost ingrained in the way the politics goes. And I think part of that comes from when you have a difficult situation to deal with and you've made bad choices, that as you go further and further down, your decision space gets that much more constrained, making your choices that much harder and making the outcomes that much worse. And I think that's why we're at the worst of both worlds. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And you're about to be listening to our next guest, Peter the Tech Guy in Jemmy. He's the author of Hail Mary, the Perfect Protestant and Catholic Prayer, and host of Your Prayer Intentions, airing on WQPH 89.3 in Shirley-Fitchburg, Massachusetts, Saturdays at noon Eastern. You can follow him on Twitter at The Tech Guy Blog and on his website, thetechguyblog.com. Pete, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Well, despite the COVID positive test, my symptoms are fairly mild. I've been quarantined for the last 3 weeks because both my wife and my younger son, who was actually going to be moving out, tested positive. So we're all kind of quarantined. So I've been on a 3-week sabbatical, burning the sick time and the vacation time that I'd just gotten back at the beginning of the year, watching reruns of Maverick and the Lord of the Rings movies.
Oh, holy crap, man! I'm sorry to hear that. I'm glad the symptoms are mild. Glad you're you got that time to burn through. That is rough. I'm really sorry to hear that. Really good luck to you.
At least I have sick time and vacation time to burn through. There's probably a lot of people who have worse situations than me. So you have to remember the perspective, and I've mentioned this on the show before. My parents were born in the 20s, my grandparents in the 1800s. My grandparents lived in a Sicily in the time before radio and television, and where they living subsistence. My parents grew up during the Great Depression. So, my father fought in World War II. So compared to that, having to sit home and watch television reruns from the 50s and the Lord of the Rings movies is not what you would call oppression. So,
no, that is admittedly milder.
And I'm here, and think about that. Think of how lucky a time I am that I am quarantined due to a pandemic, and yet I can appear on a radio show, heard in D.C., heard in places. I mean, I'm a lucky guy. How can I complain when I have those things going for me? And that's one of the advantages of knowing history, is that you can have that perspective. When you have no perspective of anything but everything on demand, you don't get that perspective. You have to be taught that perspective, which is important in life.
Yeah, and it's not just useful factually, but like you're saying, it helps to sort of reframe your view of your own life, reframe it, morally, philosophically. I'm sure you would see it religiously as well.
I mean, we don't, and as a general rule, we do not understand how lucky we are in so many ways. I mean, there's a lot of things right now that I'm not pleased with and that may cause some trouble down the line. But as a whole, individuals are living better lives and easier lives, mostly due to technology, industrialization. Just a washing machine, for God's sakes. People forget that the washing machine meant hours of labor that did not have to happen. A woman's entire day back in the early 19th century, or in the 19th century and early 20th century, might be cleaning clothes. And now washing machine, put it in the washer, you put it in a pod, you hit a button, you pour in some liquid, you hit a button. The change that made, basically the creation of leisure time, and one of the reasons why our celebrities are so empowered compared to what celebrities were thought of 150 years ago, is that Americans in general, and now in other places of the world, which is why you see the globalization of it, people have free time that they did not have. People don't understand that free time as a concept for humans is a fairly recent development in human development. The idea that we have spare time.
Well, I mean, there is a history there. I would say there is a history there. This goes back thousands of years. You can look at the Greeks. I'm forgetting the word, but I mean, there's different societies. The problem is that usually the people who have had free time historically have been the people at the top of the stack. And the people at the top of political hierarchies, they basically had been the people who had a sufficient number of people under them working for them that they had enough free time to think and do whatever they wanted. And now, in some sense, we have technology working for us. And, there's still intense hierarchies. Things are, I would argue, more unequal than they have ever been. And yet, despite that, or even, some would say because of it, a lot of people, like you're saying, do have free time.
Well, that's the thing, and that's one of the questions. Whenever I hear the word inequality, my BS antenna goes up, and the reason for that is that you will, and you can go back to Christ on that. Their poor will always be among us, for example, or from Scripture. You will always have the poor among you. Will not always have me among you. The question has never been the distance between the richest rich person and the poorest poor person. The question is how high up you raise that floor where the masses of people are. If you have a society that raises the situation, I don't give a care how rich. I mean, what do I care what Steve Jobs has? It's not my business what Steve Jobs has. What do I care how many houses some guy? I don't care that another person has these things. I care, and the average person cares. Or, can I feed my family? And do I have a place to live? Can I have these things? And the more the average person is able to function and function comfortably, the better society is. And that's the real question. That's why you have so many people come when you've seen people coming in, because I've worked with lots of immigrants. And in my regular job, I do. And you'll see people buy a house together. You'll see them work like dogs. And then they'll raise their position, and that raises the position of their children. The children will talk about buying houses together, and then raise their status. And that's something that people coming to America have done ever since there's been an America.
Pete,
and it's
I agree.
one of the things
It does matter how much income inequality exists. I mean, even if you want to get into this idea of how a social pressure is created where people tend to die earlier because of the income status. And by the way, even from the standpoint of the differential in income, that allows political clout, political power, that allow them to basically increase their lot that much more and allowing other people's lot not. I mean, for example, why do you think Medicare for all? Or why do you think that the expansion of Social Security, many of these policies that the majority of the American public, by like 70%, agree with, but the elites, let's say the Pelosis of the world, the McConnells of the world, who don't need those things, the media of the world that don't need those things, they have no need for those things because they can afford those things. I'm making the point that the differential in income matters from the standpoint of social pressure, but also from the standpoint of the influence that it allows them to buy in our political space. Do you disagree with that?
I think I think your premise is wrong in the sense that you've had the Pelosi's and you've had the Bill Gates, you've had the very, very richest who will not have to pay for any of this stuff, and would put it on the credit card, supporting all this stuff for quite a while. And in fairness to this, and this is one of the few things, and I mentioned this week, one of the few things that I don't think that the new administration is going to be able to legitimately be criticized for will be increased spending, because while I think the previous administration spent pretty wisely, they still spent fairly free, and people suddenly decide, I can't see people who were budget hawk during the Obama years suddenly not budget hawk during the Trump years, and suddenly budget hawk again. I mean, you have a few like a Rand Paul who were fairly consistent. And I'll give a guy like that a pass because he's extremely consistent. But that's one of the criticisms of the new administration that I just don't have a lot of patience for, because people did not have that same criticism over the last administration. And I don't see it as a credible complaint.
Wait, real quick, just to interrupt real quick, Pete.
I don't see complaining about spending as it comes, and there'll be a lot of spending coming. I can't bring myself to criticize spending because I wasn't criticizing the spending under Trump. I was uncomfortable with it, but I let it go. And if I let it go there, then there'll be plenty. There's with National Guard troops sleeping in a place with one toilet for large crowds. I'm not going to be criticizing this administration over spending, especially, like I said, there was a lot of spending last time around. But the real danger of that spending, the difference is the interest rates. If interest rates go up, as long as the interest rates were where they've been one of the best things that Bill Clinton did, and one of the few things I gave him credit for, was he kept interest rates very low. And if you have very low interest rates, then if you're borrowing large, there isn't a big bite. But once you start getting interest rates up, then that's when it starts to bite. If Biden can keep interest rates low, then the spending, while bad in the long term, is not going to be.
That also means that it incentivizes companies to borrow more money, meaning it's not the average person that benefits entirely from that, even though they do benefit to some degree if they have a house or something like that. It's the people who are basically at these companies who are borrowing tons and tons of money where the interest rate stays low. You're not worried about zombie companies that come from this kind of borrowing that can take place for the interest rates? I don't even think this is something that the Wall Street is agreeing with.
I think given our deficit, it's a greater worry for the debt to come due. If you have to worry about, and again, it's a question of priorities. If we had a lower national debt, then your argument would have more weight. But because we have such a large national debt, you have to think what would hurt the most. It's like the difference between it's actually a lot like the initial COVID arguments that we were having about whether or not the cure was worse than the disease. You have to pick the least worst choice, and that's why I'm laughing now, because it's like there's a lot of Biden bad luck happening and Biden miracles happening. And it's one of the Biden miracles that is happening is suddenly the mayor of D.C., who was, we have to lock down these restaurants. Suddenly it's safe enough to restore lockdowns. When the last president was saying, we need to open up, and Cuomo was talking about him being a killer, suddenly in New York, suddenly in Chicago, those same leaders are suddenly talking about opening up again. When the previous president wanted to change some of the standards in terms of the testing, and people, you're just trying to hide the numbers. Now suddenly who, with a different administration in, is saying, we need to only test here. I mean, this was just in the last couple of days. You didn't see Amazon, for example, offering to help with distribution of the vaccine while Trump was president. And, I mean, does that mean that the vaccine didn't need to be distributed at that time? No, because suddenly the person they want in charge. Even Twitter, if you look this week, in the last 2 days, Twitter has suddenly decided that certain Antifa accounts needed to be banned as long as they were considered hitting the Trump administration or things helping to stop his reelection. They were tolerated. Now the useful idiots are becoming less useful. And so you're seeing these little Biden miracles, but now you're also going to see these little Biden bad lucks, like the Keystone Pipeline cancellation. I was writing.
That's a good thing.
How he was putting out 1,000 layoff checks.
That's a good thing. That's an extremely good thing. I got to, Pete. Wait, we have to end this, Pete. But I thank you for coming on. Look, from the standpoint of Keystone Pipeline, I consider that a good thing. I don't think it should have ever been legitimized in the first place. But I do agree with you. There will be some Biden miracles that will immediately happen now that Biden is in office. I'm not sure if the ones that you talk about are the ones I would agree with, but I do agree that they would happen. Peter, the tech guy, and Jimmy is author of Hail Mary, the Perfect Protestant, and Catholic Prayer, and host of Your Prayer Intentions, airing on WQPH 89.3 in Shirley, Fitchburg, Massachusetts, Saturday at noon Eastern. You can also follow Pete on Twitter at The Tech Guy Blog and on his website, thetechguyblog.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with Ted Rall.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is political cartoonist and syndicated columnist Ted Rall. Ted, welcome to the show, man. How you doing today?
How are you guys doing?
I think we're doing okay. Have you been keeping safe and so forth? What part of the world are you in, by the way?
I'm in Manhattan.
Okay, so you're in New York. Fair enough. Good. So let's get into some politics. Joe Biden, of course, President of the United States. I'm pretty sure you know at this point. And from the standpoint of the executive orders that Joe Biden has been signing immediately, everything from trying to help with the minimum wage for basically people who work for the federal government, increasing the rate of the COVID-19 response and the capabilities, including the distribution centers. And he wants to put $1.9 trillion for various items. What do you think so far about the first few days of Biden and the executive orders? Not enough? Too little, too late? How do you view this?
yet not enough. Too little, too late. It's moving in the right direction. But if you need, 2 doses of a pill, if you need 2 doses of a vaccine to get rid of COVID, and you just get the one and you never get the second one, you're not vaccinated and you're still vulnerable to COVID, right? You're not 50% cured or 50% not vulnerable to COVID. So similarly, Joe Biden is currently coming into office with a truly frightening situation economically. Last week, 900,000 Americans filed first-time unemployment claims. The week before, it was 1 million. Now, to compare that with the 2008-2009 economic crisis, Barack Obama came in, and he was losing about 500,000 jobs a month or 600,000 jobs a month. So this is, exponentially higher. Now, Barack Obama's stimulus package, such as it was, did not lift the economy out of recession. And it basically took a good solid 6-7 years for Americans to start to find jobs and recover. And many of them, of course, never did. Many of them were never able to become homeowners again after they were evicted, sometimes illegally. Biden's problem's a lot bigger. He needs a much bigger stimulus package than is currently being contemplated. I mean, $1,400, or if you count it as $2,000, the way he's counting it, including the Trump $600 stimulus, one-time payment is just not going to help people whose average rent is $2,500 a month. And that's just rent. People have to eat. They have to pay for overpriced health care. I really think that they don't understand the gravity of the problem. And that's true just across the board. Rejoining the Paris Accord, again, that's nice, needed to happen, but we need to go to zero carbon emissions, next week. We can't wait till 2030, much less 2050, as Joe Biden wants to do. It's just tepid. It's reversing the damage that Trump did just doesn't begin to do what we need to do.
I love you're rubbing salt in the wounds, Ted. You're doing the thing that Biden wouldn't want to do, which is, of course, to compare him to the presidential, the president whose administration he was vice president in. He was during the debates in 2020 comparing himself favorably to Obama a number of times, trying to pass him on all counts. But like you're saying, he's coming into a worse situation and he's doing less to handle it. How long do you think it's going to take before the media, and I don't know if the media is ever going to do it really, but specifically before parts of Congress start to pressure Biden for more? I mean, how long is the sort of Trump aura, the malefic aura that is still lingering and that's allowing pretty much everybody to give Biden a pass on this stuff? How long do you think it's going to take before that fades away, Ted?
Well, I don't think Congress is going to pressure for more. I think at this point, there's a lot of deficit hawks, and not just on the Republican side of the aisle. A lot of Democrats are, they swallowed the Kool-Aid of supply-side economics and austerity politics, neoliberalism, and, deficits only matter when they're run up in order to help individuals. They don't matter when it's for tax cuts for the wealthy or for the military. So I think there's going to be some cheapness there. I don't think there's going to be sort of leftward pressure coming from Congress until sort of after it's clearly too late. I mean, they're talking right now about this $1,400 stimulus, $1.9 trillion stimulus package going through the Senate, and hopefully, if McConnell doesn't screw it up, it should get signed sometime in late March or perhaps April. They're kidding, right? I mean, how much of an economy is going to be left by April? They're crazy. These checks should be going out right now, and there should be more just like them 2 or 3 weeks from now, and going on forward until most Americans are vaccinated, herd immunity kicks in, warm weather happens. We have to get through to like July, August. That's when the sun is going to shine and come out, and the cloud of COVID is going to start to lift. But that's an eternity. And we're not going to make it unless there's a lot more stimulus. I live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. easily half of every business is boarded up permanently. I don't imagine that they're going to be filling up and that there's going to be renewed economic activity anytime soon.
I want to come back to that. I want to come back to Manhattan later. I think last time we had talked to you, I forget exactly where you were. It was somewhere in New York. I don't know. I don't think it was upstate. We can come back to that. But I want to hear about what Manhattan's like now that you've gotten back, because I've heard that it's almost a ghost town. And from what you're saying, that bears out. And also briefly, you're talking, on the point of the last question that I asked you in your response, under Trump in 2020, there was this weird situation where Trump was befuddling Republicans because he was actually, arguably that was not nearly enough either. He was actually pushing for more than many Republicans were comfortable with, and he was able to get it through. And at this, shortly after Democrats were pushing back against Trump and Republicans for not pushing through a large enough stimulus bill, when it came to pass, when Trump was pushing for the $2,000 stimulus checks, Pelosi was silent and somewhat infamously had to defend that on the news media. I forget exactly who it was. I think it might have been Wolf Blitzer that she was talking to at the time, who was pressuring her, why isn't this stuff going through? And
she was like, we feed them, Wolf. We feed them. You're being disrespectful, Wolf. I remember that.
Exactly. That was the quote. Anyway, I just wanted to add that in. Jamarl, what do you think?
No, I remember what you're saying. Yeah, that interview was amazing. Because Wolf Blitzer was basically pushing Nancy Pelosi saying, well, why don't you take the $1.8 trillion? Why don't you take the $1.8 trillion? And Pelosi was like, you're being disrespectful, Wolf. You're not understanding. You're disrespecting the people who are in the different committees, as if disagreeing with Pelosi is somehow disagreeing. It's very astonishing in the way, it was very weird in the way that she was arguing that with Wolf Blitzer, and then turns around and accepts half as being completely acceptable. Yeah, that's a little weird, to put it mildly, Shane. What do you expect to happen from this, Ted? Because you make a good point. They told people they were going to give them $2,000. Now, Mitch McConnell, basically, I think he is probably going to try to make Biden a one-term president also, despite the fact that he probably get along with Biden quite well from the standpoint of, let's say, an emotional rapport. Both of these guys were in the Senate for a very long time. There's this kind of collegial attitude in the Senate. Supposedly they're different than the House. But at the same token, Mitch McConnell is perfectly aware of his team. And if he can undermine Joe Biden in getting that $1,400 out, he probably will, especially if it gets them to repudiate something that they said they were going to do under Ossoff and Warnock. What do you think? How do you think this turns out? I guess what I'm getting at is do you think at some point Biden recognizes this is far worse than what I thought, and as such changes? Or do you think they're just so tone deaf and so out of it that the American public can basically catch on fire and they'll still be in this kind of austerity mindset? Do you think that the pain and difficulty is enough to change perspective? Or this is just, neoliberal politics, markets are great, human beings matter less?
Closer to that second part. I'm going to see an anemic stimulus package go through. Maybe everyone's going to get an $800 check in May or June, and then I would say I would fully expect the $15 minimum wage to be thrown under the bus as sort of a stop to the Republicans. Maybe it becomes 12. Hey, such a big increase from $7.25 or whatever it is now. Yay us. We rule, even though, it should be $28 an hour if it had kept up with inflation since 1970. And I don't think that, I just don't think they are clued in at all to just how bad this is. And it's their particular personalities that make me think that. I think it's, it's history. We're in a collapsing empire. And whether you're talking about the last Roman Senate before the Visigoths, came into Rome, or you're talking about any regime that's really sort of teetering on the edge, there sort of tends to be this obliviousness. And you just see it, I don't think Pelosi gets it. They know that it's a problem. What they don't get it, this isn't a recession. This is a depression. And it's very serious, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel at this point. Now, the irony is they have the key to their own prison cell. They can fix this, but they're just not going to.
And look, they have 51 votes. And Sanders has basically been itching to use budget reconciliation to get a list of items passed. I mean, Sanders went through basically what he would do in his 100 days if he had basically the same setup in Congress, saying, look, budget reconciliation would allow us to pass health care for people with COVID, to get rid of the student debt, he had a list of items that were expansive, increase wages to $15 an hour. He is planning or wants to basically push this as far as he can push it. His idea is we need to knock it out of the park. The next person who comes in will not be incompetent like Trump, and they will be able to use the political device for far worse ends. The voice you guys have been listening to is Ted Rall, political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Ted Rall, political cartoonist and syndicated columnist, who you should follow, by the way, on Twitter and his website. Twitter, Ted Rall. His website, rall.com, and that's R-A-L-L. Ted, thank you again for being with us. Let's talk about coups for a minute. In the weeks leading up to, after the election, leading up not just to the inauguration, but to what happened on January 6th, I remember very distinctly you saying that Trump was pushing for a coup of some kind or another, because basically he saw himself as standing on his last political leg. He was worried that if he got pushed out of political office, then he would come under legal pressure, be put in prison, very possibly, and that he was willing to do anything to forestall that possibility. Now, here's the thing. It's a mixed bag. But I've got to give it to you in some basic sense, because on January 6th, very notably, there was this sort of attempted insurrection thingy at the White House. There was a raid on the Capitol building. Hundreds of people broke into the Capitol building. Thousands of people flooded its steps. And there was a limp response from Capitol Police at the time. Some people even saying that they basically let them in. It was basically permitting the protesters / rioters / raiders, whatever you want to call them, to enter the building. Anyway, that happened. And the same day Trump said he loved them and that they were very special people. However, he also asked them to leave. And the next day he called them criminals. So a confusing set of responses from Trump, to say the least. But this event happened. I just want to, hand it over to you sort of in retrospect and looking forward. But first, in retrospect, what do you think about what happened, especially because you had been predicting something like this for weeks? I remember, Ted.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate that. I'm not glad that it happened, but I think, I suspect that something like this was going to happen, and obviously, you never know the details before it does, and we don't really know the details exactly of what happened here either. I mean, I'm really kind of on tenterhooks about the question of how many, if any, congressmen intentionally gave tours to to rioters on January 5th. I'm interested in the question of whether Trump or his top officials may have had discussions vis-a-vis the Proud Boys and so on. I mean, the head of the Proud Boys was met with Trump personally shortly before the coup attempt. So, I really, I would love to know just to what extent was this a Hail Mary pass, and to what extent did Trump fully hope that this succeeded as he was watching in the party tent while Gloria was playing on, in the background. So, I mean, I think, look, Trump remains a desperate man. I would not, it's going to be much harder for him and his supporters to launch any kind of attempt to topple the government now that Trump no longer has his hand on the levers of power, and that, he's clearly thrown the Proud Boys and other groups under the bus when it failed, which, like I did a cartoon, for Sputnik yesterday, where it was, pointing out, oh my God, a politician worked you up and then betrayed you when things didn't go well. Look, what a shock. I never saw that coming. So, but the underlying instability of the system represented by what happened on Capitol Hill still remains an issue. I mean, I think of the Sepoy Rebellion in India under the British Raj. It failed. The local Indian soldiers rose up and revolted against their British masters, and they eventually were all slaughtered. But it sent a message to future insurrectionists throughout the British Empire and revolutionaries and independence activists, hey, with a little more oomph, these Brits are not undefeatable. And, you could look at the Capitol Hill incursion and think, with a little more oomph, and that could have worked, with some simultaneous actions in a few other places, that might have happened, might have worked. So if you have those kinds of designs and you're on the far right, your mind is working. You're thinking about it. And, that's got to be something that, if I were the head of the Homeland Security or the FBI, I would be deeply concerned about.
Yeah, I agree with you on this. I think I made a similar argument that this wasn't a failure, that people were alienated by either government or by society or whatever else because of ideas and views they may hold that may be antagonistic to this notion of inclusion or multiculturalism, that they didn't see this as a failure, at least I don't think. I mean, at the end of the day, they were able to breach the Capitol borders. They were able to ransack multiple rooms in the Capitol. And yeah, they put 25,000 troops now, but like you said, the 25,000 troops are not going to stay there forever. And if you're looking at it, this looks successful. I think the best case scenario out of this for Trump would have been a civil war. That's how bad I think this would have turned out. And I think this kind of a coup in the open, just because it was in the open, didn't make it better. Meaning just because he was petitioning Mike Pence in the press, or just because he was calling these other political leaders, doesn't make it better. Meaning just because it wasn't behind the scenes doesn't make it any less of a coup. Do you think they're going to impeach him, and do you think they should impeach him? Meaning, do you think they're going to convict him? Let's say it that way.
Well, let's put it this way: if he should be convicted, no president should ever be convicted for anything. I mean, within the rules of the system, clearly he suborned insurrection and the overthrow of the state. He sat on his hands and he clearly hoped that this would succeed. So, he should be convicted, obviously. Now, will he be? It's all going to come down to Mitch McConnell. If Mitch McConnell has already decided that it's to his advantage to not have to worry about Donald Trump running in 4 years, and he just wants to sort of be rid of Trumpism, he will do that. But there's a price to pay, right? Obviously, he has to thread the needle carefully. If he is seen as the guy who stabbed, or the Republicans are seen as having stabbed their own Trump in the back, and convict in the Senate, there's going to be hell to pay in very red districts in 2022. There's going to be all sorts of radical right primary challenges to establishment Republicans. So they're very well aware of that, and they're kind of like, they would love. I think McConnell and his gang would love to convict Trump and be rid of him, but they just can't do it. They want to stab Caesar. but they don't want blood all over their togas when they do it. So that's what's tough for them.
Well, and that's why I'm, everybody's wondering what's actually going to happen. Everybody's wondering if they're going to go through it. Trump's base is still definitely with him, at least a significant fraction of them, and his base was a lot of the Republican base. So that's patently obvious. Let's disagree for a moment. I could go in the direction of Parler, and we could talk about social media stuff. But let's talk about the impeachment. Trump, the day of the event, called for them to peacefully march on Congress. And then when they were in the building, he told them to go home. Now, admittedly, during that same event, his lawyer, Giuliani, and his son, Don Jr., with either carefully chosen or poorly chosen words, called for, a trial by combat and to, to go into we'll be in your backyards and we're going to enjoy it. I'm paraphrasing very slightly. Anyway, those were their statements respectively. So, the day of, he's calling for them to peacefully march on Congress, not to violently march on Congress. While the event's going on, he's telling them to go home. And then the next day, he does the backstab thing. He does the confusing turnaround and calls them criminals. I don't know if politically that's going to make much of a difference, but isn't that legally not incitement? If he's calling for, doesn't a president or any political leader have a right to call for citizens to peacefully protest? That doesn't seem to be against the law to me. Ted, what's your take?
Well, impeachment is not and conviction in the Senate is it's a political process, not a legal process, even though it's dressed up in the veneer of legality and legalistic sounding procedures. So it doesn't matter. I mean, like in a criminal case, would I vote on a jury to convict where, beyond a reasonable doubt, which is basically considered 90% or more certain? No, I don't think I would. In a civil case, which is based on a preponderance of the evidence, more than 50% sure, probably I would vote to convict. But I don't think that an impeachment in the Senate even has to rise to that standard of proof. I think it's one of those pornography, you recognize it when you see it kind of standards, and you either buy it or you don't. I would counter to the defenses that you raised in Trump's favor, that Trump sat on his hands for hours while these events unfolded, that he repeatedly promoted the protest, that he repeatedly claimed to have he refused to concede. He was the first president in history, as far as I know, to have taken so long to concede, and that his repeated, tweeting and ranting about how the election had been stolen. Look, he really riled people up, and that's not presidential. It's not in the United States. So, is it an easy, clean? Yeah, no question, more than 90% sure he should be convicted? No, but impeachment in the Senate doesn't call for that or require it.
Yeah, and personally, I have qualms with this idea of going forward with this being implicitly okay. In the same way that George Bush invading Iraq became implicitly okay because there was no consequences for it. In fact, they've been rehabilitating George Bush. I mean, George Bush, Obama, the media was fawning over this. I don't know if you saw this, Ted, that these guys on MSNBC, maybe even CNN, were calling these guys the Avengers, saying that Bush, Obama's, and the Clintons basically were the Avengers, getting rid of Donald Trump. This is the imagery of this is so over the top. It's so over the top. I think I agree with you on this front that this is not a political thing. This is not a legal thing. This is political. And are we okay with the president? Look, did Donald Trump do this in good faith? I think that's the question for me. And do I believe he did this in good faith? I don't believe he did this in good faith. And that's why for me, it's impeachment. Let's do this. Manhattan. Before we close, Shane wanted to ask you about the grounds, or what is it like in Manhattan? So what is going on in Manhattan right now? Your basic surroundings. Like you said, Shane made the point of it sounding like a ghost town. 40% of retail, by my last perusal, was basically closed up across the United States. So I can imagine New York is probably looking rough, especially with the number of casualties that you guys had there. So what does Manhattan look like right now when you walk out your doors? What is, if you had to explain it to the rest of the world, what do you see around you?
Man, I would love to have 40% of retail closed. That would be a major improvement. It looks like 80 to 90% to me and whenever I go around the city. So, whether you're in my neighborhood on the Upper West Side or Midtown, probably roughly a third of business storefronts are boarded up and sometimes covered with graffiti. And then probably maybe another fourth or another fifth are just closed and spaces are sort of sadly for rent. There's outdoor dining, which is kind of hilarious because, we're not allowed to eat inside. Basically, the restaurants have created these sheds out of plywood and plastic and heating lamps out on the street where people are basically inside but out on the sidewalk eating at restaurants. And, thank God for that. Otherwise, they would all go out of business. There's a ton of homelessness.
15.
They're, visible.
Ted, we're going to have to interject. I apologize. But thank you for the heads up. That's deplorable, to put it mildly. We shouldn't be at that point. Ted Rall is a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. You can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rall and read his cartoons and articles on Raw.com and on Twitter at Ted Rall. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for our last hour this week. The last hour of the most disruptive show in America and around the world, covering news, events, politics, and more. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Going into the headlines this morning, first up in COVID news, at least 4,142 new coronavirus deaths and 190,630 new cases were reported in the U.S. yesterday, January 21st. Over the past week, there has been an average of 188,110 cases per day. That's a decrease of 21% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 24,688,000 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, and at least 410,336 people have died from it. President Joe Biden plans to sign 2 executive orders today, including expanding food stamps and beginning the process to require that everyone working for the federal government get a minimum wage of $15 an hour. National Economic Council Director Brian Deese said the orders, which add to a slew Biden has already approved, are not a substitute for the massive $1.9 trillion COVID-19 relief bill that Biden hopes Congress will pass, but rather a critical lifeline for millions of Americans who need assistance now. I'm going to pause on that for a second. I'm guessing I know your answer, but there's this ongoing conversation about the Congress branch, Congressional branch, the legislative branch, effectively in remission, not able to act as an agent for executing the best interest of the American people, and the subsequent and meanwhile, the growth of the executive branch, the growth of executive orders, basically politics by fiat. I know you don't care about this one particularly. I know that you're in favor, I'm guessing, of both of these executive orders. But what do you think about the general case? Do you think that case applies, that there's something worrying about the fact that the president has to, or at least is becoming, a sort of dictator of power? And I don't mean that in the colloquial sense, but more in a classic sense or a technical sense, where he is, by executive order, by his order, deciding sort of the interests of the state in a way that might overstep the boundaries as classically defined in America of the executive branch. Jamarl, what's your take on that?
In any other country, this would be considered a failure of an institution, like not having a government that can function and deal with the material needs of the public. I mean, Biden basically has to pass the stuff, like you said, by executive order. And Congress doesn't seem to be able to get anything done. I mean, in fact, when you were looking at, for example, the Obama administration, where there was supposed to be unyielding opposition that was determined on day one while Obama was being inaugurated, that is not the way government is supposed to work. Like, the political parties are supposed to work in the interests of government. The opposition is supposed to be loyal opposition. The key being loyal. Loyal to who? Not the party, loyal to the government itself of the United States of America. Meaning the loyal opposition is in the interest of the American public, not in the interest of this kind of small body of people who are putting money in their pockets or running a credit card through their butt cheeks. And this goes for both political parties. So it's like, yes, this is good, but this is modest. And this feeds back into the scam of one side being, we're not going to offer anything. We're going to fight for the interests of the rich and this kind of wholehearted thing. And the other side doing the same thing, but basically giving theatrics and, this kind of rhetoric to everyone else. Yes, of course I'm going to agree with this. But it's like, when you look at this, it's like, if I throw pennies at somebody, is that really sufficient for what they need? And is that what it's owed? You know what I mean? Like, it goes beyond just the individual things. And I do think we need to question ourselves on whether this is the way government's supposed to function. And if there's a problem with this. Lazar might be right. That this bespeaks of this kind of ossification and intransigence of our ability to actually pass laws in the interest of the public. And there's something wrong when the government gets to the point where you can't do that. So, yeah, yes, I'm for it. But yes, there's also something seriously wrong with our government.
I agree with you. And it's not just the president's fault. It's not just any president's fault. Like you're saying, it's a failure of Congress. Anyway, in our next headline, Amazon Inc. said yesterday that it will open a pop-up clinic in its Seattle headquarters on January 24th with an aim to vaccinate 2,000 eligible members of the public against COVID-19 on its first day of operations. This comes as after 2 days ago on Wednesday, Amazon sent a letter to the Biden administration telling them they were happy to work with them on vaccine relief. Lindsey Graham sort of, Pete and Jemmy were talking about this with him earlier. Lindsey Graham called this disgusting. If they weren't willing to work with the Trump administration, the fact that they're now working with the Biden administration, he called that disgusting. I'm going to agree with Graham on this one. I often don't. If they could have helped, they should have. They shouldn't have reserved that for, the sake of whatever political clout they'd get by teaming up with Biden instead of Trump, because, that's lives on the line. But that's politics for you, I guess. Nearly 2,000 doses of Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine were spoiled at a Boston area VA facility after a cleaning contractor accidentally loosened a plug for a freezer. Again, these vaccines need to be stored at extremely low temperatures in order to retain their efficacy to not spoil. So he added he doesn't think the spoiled doses will affect the vaccine rollout and told the newspaper that replacement doses were already being delivered. Moderna COVID-19 vaccines, as well as doses developed by rival Pfizer-BioNTech, must be stored at very low temperatures. Again, that's between -13 and -5 degrees Fahrenheit. In national political news, Kentucky Republican Mitch McConnell has pushed back against Joe Biden's first executive moves, slamming them as showing the Democrat president to be already headed in the wrong direction. He tweeted yesterday saying, quote, "The failed Paris deal will hurt American families while China and Russia grow emissions. The Keystone cancellation will kill union jobs and hurt U.S. energy security. And a proposal to gut immigration enforcement and give blanket amnesty, rough day one for American workers," end quote. I want to come back to the Keystone pipeline. I think the way this went was bungled. And broadly, I think we should look more closely at obviously transitioning to renewables and, both fission and fusion nuclear energy. Frankly, those seem safer if they're handled right and with more up-to-date requirements than we've often seen in the past. But when it comes to oil, I still think I don't know about fracking specifically, but I don't know how else you're going to do it. I don't view it as energy security. I view it as loosening America's links to Saudi Arabia and our dependence on this whole petrodollar arrangement, which I argue is deleterious to America's interest, everybody's interest, frankly. I think it's a problem. But I don't know. I'm just going to be honest as a person. I don't know how to straddle that line with what appear to be, I've got reservations about fracking, the way this pipeline was handled, the negative externalities from it. It could and seems to have already really hurt certain Native American tribes in the area, in South Dakota, North Dakota. Does that make any sense, Jamarl? Are you following me on this one? I'm going to get some pushback here. That's okay. But what do you think?
I do understand where you're coming from. You're basically making the point that energy is a real thing that we need. And taking this kind of stance that we are not going to use X or Y can, undermine that position, right? Because you still need energy. You have all sorts of energy requirements. The number of people who are in your society are growing, the number just by the birth rate. And as such, your energy requirements continue to expand year after year after year. And the question is, how do you meet those demands? And can you do it without oil? That's the question I think you're asking. And it goes both ways. There's a geopolitical aspect of this, meaning gutting our reliance on the Middle East for oil and becoming more self-reliant and self-dependent where we don't necessarily need that. The problem is we sell our oil. Like our oil is being sold to other places. Like we become an exporter. I guess the question becomes, is it possible to do it without oil? And is it possible to do it fast? Meaning, is it possible to ramp up? And more importantly, do you have to do it without oil just because of the environmental consequences of continuing to use the same steps? If you're using battery power, for example, you still have a ramp-up cost. Meaning the carbon and all of that stuff still ramps up until you get to the point where the things are created and the things are built where you can put those systems into place. Meaning you have to start soon if you're ever going to get over that hump. And so you have to start somewhere. Now, Keystone Pipeline, I think they said like 35 permanent jobs and a bunch of temporary jobs. And on top of that, is that oil going to go to the United States or is that fracked oil going to go outside of the country? I think that also matters. I understand where you're coming from, but is it possible to do it without continuing to open oil wells and oil fields? And if we really are serious about climate, if we do trust the scientists in the way that we say it, should we continue to exploit oil or should we look for something else? Does it make sense? Like
we certainly should. No, of course, yeah. No, we're surprisingly, I think we're in pretty much complete agreement on this one. We should look to other sources, and like you're saying, batteries are the real thing there. One of the main benefits of oil, other than it's just simply its energy density, is its portability. The fact that you can have a relatively small engine burning a relatively small amount of oil in vehicles, for instance, in automobiles, ships, etc. It's easy to ship. And you already have a bunch of it. You already have access to a bunch of it, and of course, it's pretty energy dense. And so, if you start burning it, you get a lot of the use out of it.
I can use it anytime. Joe Manchin makes the argument.
Exactly.
You can use oil at any time. You don't have to depend on wind or solar. But the catch is, the moment that you get solar power and you get batteries, well, that's off the table now. I mean, because you can use that power in the batteries for the wind. Meaning, you could save the wind power into batteries. You could save the other. Yeah, right. And the houses. The Elon Musk houses, where they basically, they would absorb power, solar power, put it in the batteries, and at nighttime they could still use the battery power. There are ways around it at 100%. This point. Yeah.
And one of the big upsides of, for instance, solar, but this would also apply to wind, is that you can have a redundant power grid. You can have a bunch of different sources who are producing oil. You have local distribution, and then you have general distribution. So that the goal is, if one part of that grid goes down for whatever reason, you have overlap, so you can fill in from other parts. And just furthermore, you're producing your own energy, which, as a sort of a classic example of self-sufficiency, is a good thing. The problem is batteries historically and still today are not as efficient as we want them to be. But over the last decade, one of the major untold stories, and it might be worth doing a segment on this, and this is in part, but I would say in large part due to what Elon Musk has been doing, is that battery efficiency has been going up like crazy. So in the same way that solar capture efficiency has gone up over time, and shows signs of continuing to increase as time goes on, so are batteries. And so, in hopefully the near future, we will be able to start to make some more major transitions. I don't think we're there yet for every sector, but more and more seem to be reaching that point. There is that ramp up cost you're talking about. But anyway, we got more headlines to get into. Interesting conversation that we should come back to with guests at some point, I believe. In international news, the Kremlin on Friday welcomed U.S. President Joe Biden's proposal to extend the last remaining nuclear arms control treaty between the two countries, which is set to expire in less than 2 weeks. Russian President Vladimir Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said that Russia stands for extending the pact and is waiting to see the details of the U.S. proposal. I've got to say, this is a good move from the Biden administration. I'm sad that Trump didn't do this, and I'm glad that Biden's doing this. Don't want nuclear war, just to put it that simply. Iran's oil minister announced today that the country has seen a record high in oil exports despite U.S. sanctions on its energy sector. The oil minister, Bijan Zanganeh, said, quote, "Our enemies wanted to zero out our oil sales, but our selfless partners let us beat petroleum export records during the sanctions period, end quote. In related Iranian news, Iran's Tasman news agency has tweeted a doctored image of Donald Trump playing golf in the shadow of an American B-2 strategic stealth bomber. The tweet reads, "Revenge is inevitable," a quote apparently taken from a remark made by Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in December when he vowed to avenge the life of top military commander General Qasem Soleimani. That, I'm just going to say, that is going to linger with us for years, and there still hasn't been a sort of significant blowback from that. Not just the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, but the assassination of, what was his name? Fakhri Mosaddegh, I think? Not Mosaddegh. But the assassination of the nuclear scientist, the top academic in Iran, by sort of unnamed outside forces, arguably Israel and the United States. Anyway, those are both going to linger with us for a while. The office of French President Emmanuel Macron said on Thursday there would be, quote, "no repentance nor apologies," end quote, for the French's 132 years of colonial rule over Algeria. Instead, Macron will take part in several symbolic acts aiming to smooth over lasting enmity from the period, which included racial apartheid, nuclear weapons tests, and ended in a brutal war of independence that forced France from the country in 1962. The number of deaths in armed violence in the Sudanese city of Al Junaina, the capital of the West Darfur state, has risen to 83. The violence broke out on Saturday after one person had been killed in a skirmish at a local camp for displaced people. The Central African Republic has declared a 15-day state of emergency throughout the country as a coalition of armed groups seeks to overthrow the newly re-elected president Faustin Archange Touadéra. Going briefly into tech news, slightly pushing past headlines time here, but Google and Facebook said they might have to stop offering some of their services in Australia if a new law which compels companies to negotiate payments to media for their content goes ahead. Legislation in question is the Digital Platforms Mandatory Bargaining Code Bill, which establishes a mandatory code of conduct, which it says should address bargaining power imbalances between digital platforms. Basically, news providers would get money. They would be able to bargain for money for providing their content to social media platforms and tech companies like Google and Facebook. According to the bill, digital platforms and news media businesses would be incentivized to reach agreements on payments for news content on those platform services. Google said on Friday that it would not be viable for the company to continue offering its search engine in Australia if the code gets the green light. And I'm going to cut it there. Those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And with that, we're going into a break. We will be back in just a minute talking with Nico House, founder of the Mikasa Sukasa Network. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back in just a minute.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you're digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so either with a chat, a tweet, and of course, by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, or at the very least help it to be what it is, so definitely don't be shy. But joining us is political activist, broadcast journalist, and founder and CEO of the MCSC Network, Nico House. Nico, what's going on, man?
Hey, gentlemen, how you guys doing?
We're doing all right. You've been keeping safe and healthy. You're in Florida, right?
Yeah, I'm in Miami, man. I'm in Miami.
So I guess we asked Ted Rall what it was like in New York, and he basically said it's a ghost town. I made the point to him that I think they said like 40% of retail had closed. He was like, yeah, that's more like 80%. So he basically things look rough in Manhattan. What are things looking like in Miami right now?
So it's not a ghost town because of the, I guess you could say, the leniency of Ron DeSantis. Now this is actually the place where people go to escape reality. So businesses are starting to open back up, but there is still the reverberating impact of just being closed for so long, and then just the knee-jerk reaction from politicians. There hasn't really been any consistent COVID policy here, or I imagine really anywhere in the country. But obviously, when you have a international service-based industry, it could be a little bit problematic. For example, like during New Year's, they had actually decided last minute that they were going to implement a curfew, when a lot of companies and businesses were expected to recoup on all the profits that they had lost. And so that's really had the biggest impact on us, is just the knee-jerk reactions and a lack of consistency policy-wise, and of course, a lack of financial assistance to the businesses, the small businesses that these corporations have been getting.
What do you think? I'm going to ask a question. By the way, thank you for joining us, Nico. I'm going to ask you the same question effectively that I asked our earlier guest, Ted Rall. When do you think Biden will stop getting a pass from the media, but more importantly, his own Congress, on not acting quickly or resolutely enough when it comes to the pandemic, as well as, the couple other crises that we as Americans are currently facing? Nico.
Shane, you've been doing this long enough to know the answer to that question, but I'll entertain it anyway. They won't give him a pass, actually. And the truth is, so we're already seeing him sign executive orders to get children back in school by 100 days. He's shipping out 100 million vaccines, even though we've been told that that's actually not supposed to solve the problem, because it could still, you can still spread the virus, et cetera, et cetera. Now you have to deal with this mutation that potentially could become a problem. But it looks like, in my opinion, Biden, like I said, I don't know if you all remember, I said once Biden gets in, all of a sudden COVID's not going to be as big of a deal as it was before. They'll probably treat it closer to something like the flu. And that's already what Biden is doing, despite the fact that Biden himself said I want to say it was September, maybe August, during the debates, that we have to shut the country down if it looks like COVID is getting out of hand, or if we haven't reined it in. And according to the teachers, it hasn't been taken care of yet. We're not even close. In fact, we're starting to see spikes lately. And so Biden, where he criticized Trump for wanting to open up safely and coming up with a plan, Biden is literally doing the exact same thing, and he's being cheered on. So we're not going to see any consistency or accountability at least from the neoliberal media under the Biden administration, and that's what we're here for.
Well, right. I don't think we're going to see consistency, but I don't think I thought it was weird that Biden is trying to force kids back to school, because it's like you're saying that everybody should wear masks for the first 100 days. Okay, fair enough. You're putting out the vaccine. Okay, fair enough. But to open up schools is something different, because that gets across. It's one thing if you open schools up once it's under control. Like if you're New Zealand, fair enough, have at it. But if you're going to criticize Trump for basically opening up schools and forcing people back to work, I have a hard time seeing what's the difference between forcing people back to work and forcing people back to schools, especially from the standpoint of the proliferation of the disease with the new variant. So I feel you on that point. Do you think, there is no leverage. I don't think there's leverage on Biden from the standpoint of the left. Do you see him standing by any of these things that he said he was going to do, either in the primaries, or basically this is Obama 2.0 with more of a hawkish foreign policy?
Obama 2.0 and more of a hawkish foreign policy. I would say all the hawkish things he's promised us for foreign policy, he's keeping those promises already. Sure, you've already seen the troop surge that he's promising in Iraq and Syria. Nobody's surprised by this, but those seem to be the only promises that he's keeping. When you're looking at, for example, the $2,000, he said literally, you win Georgia, then the $2,000 is out the door, is what he said. Well, I don't know was it out the door and then like you get another door on the way to the mailbox or my bank account, because that has not happened yet. We have, as a matter of fact, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's been zero talk about it, really.
Well, right. The conversation about the 2000 went like it. dropped to 1,400 immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was like, well, wait a minute, you told people 2,000. And I know some people might say, well, that's not a great distinction. I'm sorry. It is $600 is a big difference, depending upon who you are, depending upon whether you need that money or not. And the entire point of this is to be a stimulus for people who need it. So yeah, I think it's problematic that he's backtracking. But you think this backtracking is just the beginning? That this is just because there was no, meaning Biden got in office without people putting any restrictions on him. Meaning he didn't get in office like, I'm going to pass big, beautiful health care like the Obama Affordable Care Act, or I'm going to get rid of it in the way that Trump said. He didn't get in with this kind of big policy agenda where, let's say, the left was holding him liable for, and or elements of the party was holding him liable for. Their entire argument was, we just got to get Trump out. Meaning Biden can do whatever he wants in that office, and it's apparently fair game. What do you think that's going to turn out? How do you think that's going to look in 4 years? I mean, that's assuming Biden even makes it to 4 years. And that gets into the question of Kamala Harris and whether or not she was wedged into that spot because she couldn't win it on her own, and they wanted this kind of continuity with a transition. You can talk about any part of that, because I know that's the question's kind of, it may be 2 or 3 parts. But this is just the beginning of him backtracking, right?
Yeah, I mean, hell, we don't have to look at 4 years. Once again, look at the 100 days. It went from, we have to make sure that we get the virus stabilized before we send our kids back to school. And now it's, well, just kidding. We need to send them back to school immediately. And we know why, right? Parents can't go back to work if their kids are not in school. That's one of the reasons I believe that they're rushing everybody back. There's already been a lot of states that have opened up. And I think that is the main goal is the Democrats are in the establishment in general are not about to put a bad economy on Biden's back. They're not going to give Trump ammo for 2024. Like, he's still not out of the picture. He's not going to be impeached. They're not going to give Trump ammo in that regard. But once again, it's scary to me because not only we're seeing him break promises, but we're actually seeing him get credit for things that he didn't even do. Like, they're like, oh, he's killed the Keystone Pipeline, for example. No, he didn't. The Supreme Court killed that months ago, under Trump, actually, after he appointed his federal judges, which was kind of a surprise for a lot of people because it was around the same time they actually killed the Dakota Access Pipeline. So they're even beginning to give him credit for things he doesn't deserve credit for. And it's really, once again, just, in my opinion, running cover for the terrible things he's already begun to implement. I want to talk about just the kids in cages. He said he's going to put a task force together within the first several hours of him becoming president in order to reunite these people back with their families. He hasn't done so. In fact, he actually went out of his way to say he's not reversing, at least immediately, any of Trump's immigration policies. The only thing that he did was reverse the Muslim ban, but not even all the countries on the Muslim ban. But effectively, we know that a lot of quote-unquote refugees do come from the Middle East because, well, to be frank, they were quote-unquote freedom fighters or rebels that we've paid or Saudi Arabia paid on behalf of us to destabilize the region. They come here seeking refuge. This is a common practice. So, like, he didn't even do it for altruistic reasons. He just did it so he can, once again, open up that revolving door to protect people who do our dirty work overseas. It's not looking pretty so far. And once again, people are still cheering about the fact that Kamala's black and their daughters have somebody that looks like them or something like that. But things are going to get a lot worse before they get better, it seems. But hopefully we'll be able to actually call them out now because Dems have no excuse anymore.
But like you're saying, the pass is going to stick with him. In other words, he's not going to come under fire for that. You know what? I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction. Like you've been talking about, there are a variety of carrots that have been sort of held out in front of us and that keep being kept at bay. But there's also the prevalent stick, which was Trump and is increasingly becoming Trump's base. What do you think about the push against domestic extremism after the events of the last, a couple of weeks ago, raid on the Capitol building? What are your, just generally, I kind of want to come back to this in the next segment, but what are your thoughts on that whole state of affairs, Nico?
It's convenient, right? Trump was able to, we talked about this actually at some point during the BLM and Antifa protests after George Floyd. We were saying Trump is falling for this idea that these places are riots and people are buying into it. And we had talked about the fact that it was going to be used to further surveillance and call them domestic terrorists. And that's exactly what happened, right? And so now in a situation where mostly Trump's base, Proud Boys show up and a few other, maybe some unsavory groups show up. But mostly, to be fair,
It was mostly just Trump supporters upset at the lack of integrity within the election, according to my team, that are a group of leftists who are on the ground there. So when we see this happen, and then no Antifa, surprisingly enough, no Antifa shows up. So it was very easy to say this is all MAGA people. They're the singular cause of this issue. Now we're going to try and make a plea that these people should be labeled as domestic terrorists, and also they need to be quote unquote deprogrammed. And AOC actually lumped in anyone who they deem to be a quote-unquote conspiracy theorist or a quote-unquote white supremacist adjacent or sympathizer. So what we are seeing, in my opinion, is Patriot Act 2.0, a ramp up, and it's not going to be in Iraq or Afghanistan anymore. It's going to be here on our own soil.
Yeah, when Obama passed the National Defense Authorization Act and added that provision in for basically to be able to use troops on home soil. And if you remember, Chris Hedges took the government to court over this. And Chris Hedges came away with the impression that the government had already started using this provision, meaning kind of focusing on some of the protests in the United States. And some of this could have came from the Occupy Wall Street movement. That after that, the response was, whoa, either we're going to have to deal with the economic realities of our population, or we're just going to have to use more repressive means. And it seems that the more repressive means is the choice that was chosen. The voice you guys have been listening to is Nico House, political activist, broadcast journalist, and founder of CEO of MCSC Network. And by the way, just to give more details on the Exxon pipeline, basically the Supreme Court blocked it, but it didn't necessarily kill it. Although the justices cleared the way for the oil and gas pipeline construction projects to use the permit, they refused to do so for XL pipeline. The rebuff also means that Keystone XL construction is delayed until 2021, which basically allowed Biden to kill it. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are still joined by our guest, Nico House, political activist, broadcast journalist, and the founder and CEO of the MCSC Network. I want to come back to this conversation about domestic terrorism and the suppression of speech in the United States. On the one hand, 2 weeks ago, there was an unprecedented raid on the Capitol building. Hundreds of people got in. Last I checked, it was 5 who had died. That number may have risen since then. But, a handful of people actually died from the day's events. And regardless, all of the news at the time was talking about how much of a stain on our democracy this was. And I frankly agree with them. But the response I was worried about the day we were talking about this, the next day, Thursday, the response I worried was going to be worse than the event itself. We've had another guest. I forget exactly who it was, but I believe you're our second guest now to use the exact phrase Patriot Act 2.0, and that fits. This might not be a specific bill that gets passed by Congress or a specific executive order from Biden. It will probably be a wave of responses, the sort of distributed set of responses to this perception of a threat coming from within our country. And I'm just going to point this out. I saw Time the other day, Time magazine on their website, talking about how there are increasing calls for a war on domestic terror. I just want to do a brief little, not a history lesson, but just a brief walkthrough. You have the world wars jumping forward quite a bit. You have LBJ with his war on poverty. You have Nixon with his war on cancer. Then you get the war on terrorism. Now you have a war on domestic terrorism. I don't mean to see these are all of a piece or that there's a direct through line, but I'm just going to point out the war went from being a sort of attempt to repair fundamental inequities in America to an attempt to solve diseases to an attempt to combat a foreign enemy to what might now very quickly become a long-running and, very clearly stated attempt to combat an internal enemy, where America is effectively having to suppress, dissident elements within our country, whether they're violent or not, because their speech is perceived as being potentially violent in its implications. Parler got blocked, both from Google and Apple. They've been taken down. They're trying, they have their server back up in some form, but they're not functioning as a site anymore. And even if they are soon functioning again, they might get taken down again very quickly. Trump got blocked from Twitter. It's been very, very silent on the Western Front without Trump making, regular tweets. Some of them pretty entertaining, some of them arguably kind of dangerous against what's going on these days. It has been quiet. People were talking for years about how quiet it would be if Trump got blocked from Twitter. And admittedly, it is. I'm kind of making light of it, but this is a serious situation in a lot of ways. I've covered a couple of things there, and you've already given some of your perspective, Nico. But like you were saying, you have friends, you have correspondents who are on the scene on January 6th and saying that this wasn't how the media was portraying it. What were they seeing? I want to get deeper into this conversation generally, but how do you think the media got this wrong specifically, Nico?
In D.C., outside of what was recorded and then subsequently uploaded from the Capitol itself, was what was taking place in the crowds, which was that actually a lot of these MAGA people were getting the hell beat out of them. Even my team got gassed. A lot of people didn't know that because for some reason, even though they couldn't stream outside of the Capitol, some people were able to stream inside of it. But like I said, the footage that didn't get seen is how a lot of these MAGA people were actually getting beat up by the cops. And there was actually some common ground finally found between these two groups, because they're like reacting like, wow, okay, now we get what they mean by the moment that we become inconvenient to them. The police state, the institution of the police state will absolutely turn on us. And that's exactly what we saw happen in D.C. In addition to that, like I said, there were a lot of people that were there just because they don't necessarily trust the outcome of the election. It's not even, by the way, it's not even that a lot of them supported Trump exclusively. A lot of them were former Bernie supporters. Some were Toast supporters, people who just generally have questioned the narrative of the media. So they wanted to be there themselves because they figured that felt like it was going to be one of those days. So some people just went just to observe to see what the outcome would be. And, like I said, the narrative has definitely shifted because when I was there for days before that, I came back to Miami the day that event took place. I was in D.C. the days before that, and police knew because they were talking to us about it, because they were kind of treating us a little bit prejudicially because of that. They wouldn't even let us walk near the Capitol because while we were doing Force the Vote. And so the police knew. The Capitol Police Chief came out and said that he asked Congress 6 times for assistance prior to that event. They refused to give it to him. So in other words, Congress knew, and yet they went to work that day anyway. And then they're now turning that and spinning it to, we were scared for our lives, therefore we must expel members of Congress for asking for accountability in our elections and integrity in our elections. And by the way, I feel like this can't be said enough. Regardless of how you feel about the Republicans or maybe their own personal reasons, they do have constitutional authority over the Electoral College. What they're doing is actually part of the checks and balance. If they have even one iota of doubt in that election, they have the responsibility to challenge the Electoral College on behalf of their constituents. They're not doing anything wrong, actually.
Well, that's honest doubt. That's honest doubt. That's good faith arguments. And I don't buy for one moment that this was in good faith. Meaning,
I can't say whether it is or whether it wasn't. But
I would say that Donald Trump and the Republicans that were pushing this weren't doing this for good faith. They had nothing. Meaning, you need to be able to say, this is what we have to show for this. And the fact that they were running around arguing that the Cubans...
I wouldn't say they wouldn't have nothing. I wouldn't say they went out to say they had nothing because of the... Until we can get transparency in the voting machines themselves.
The argument that Donald Trump and his people were making was that the Cubans, working with Hugo Chavez, working with Nicolas Maduro, with the Chinese, and of course the CIA, because they're socialists and the socialists can't do anything on their own. That was their argument. That wasn't the argument. You're
talking about one specific instance of a specific voting software where the guy said it was used by Hugo Chavez to rig elections in Venezuela, but actually our CIA was using that machine to rig elections in Venezuela against Hugo Chavez. But
was using that as an argument. Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani basically disowned her after she made the argument because they realized how ridiculous the argument was. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, like, don't get me wrong. I agree with that argument itself. In and of itself is ridiculous. But at the end of the day, the truth is the lack of transparency is the only reason that you even have 100,000 people plus on Capitol Hill. Because if it was really okay, shut up, open and shut, cut and dry, we have access, we see who won, we can check the discrepancies and figure out if it was legitimate or if it was accidental or nefarious, then we move on. But the lack of transparency, because as you already know, just to figure out what's in the machines costs hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars over time in one state. So if you can even figure out what's in the machines, how can you ever get to the point of figuring out if there was a legitimate pushback?
No,
if you have that doubt, then in my opinion, as a congressperson, there should have actually been more people to challenge the outcome just until we get concrete numbers based on transparent access to these voting machines.
Yeah, but the problem is Republicans and Democrats neither push for transparency. I mean, one of the things that Tulsi Gabbard did that was extremely good was trying to push to basically make the voting system more transparent. Because the honest reality of it is, if you're in a situation where your legitimacy is conferred through the vote, meaning it's the ballot itself that makes the determination of who's legitimate, and the public itself, gives that power, gives that leeway for it. Well, you need to know as a flat fact of sorts who won, and not having that transparency makes that process worse. So I agree with you on that point. I also agree with you that neither party wants to fix it. How weird is that? Like the millions that it takes just to figure out, the challenge to votes total. And even when you challenge the vote total, oftentimes you're not even challenging the vote tally. You're just challenging what came out of the machine, which, again, doesn't entirely get to the root of whether or not the machine is accruing it accurately. So I agree with you on the transparency issue. Why do you think that Republicans and Democrats, it seems that both, are on board for not doing anything about the integrity of the electoral system, or at the very least the transparency involved in that system? What's the issue with that? Like, why do you think that both of them just kind of walk hand in hand? Because I don't entirely have an answer for this. I think both of them take turns gaming the system in regards to the way they go about it. And adding the level of transparency in it makes it problematic on this notion of who actually won the race and giving questions about who won. Meaning it makes it difficult or more difficult to cheat if it's transparent. And if you have a situation where both parties at some point believe that they can game it, maybe they just don't touch it. Or maybe it's just you can't get anything in agreement with on the electoral system because neither party wants to give an inch. What do you think about this, though? Why do you think that basically nobody backed Gabbard's plan to make it more transparent? And this was after everybody kept screaming that Donald Trump basically hacked the election or something. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? Like, basically, everybody was complaining that the electoral system, or that something nefarious went on in the last election. Nobody wanted to ensure that the systems were transparent, save for one or two people in the electoral system, meaning in the politics space. Why? Why do you think it happens that way?
This is a question that we've had to deal with for the last 2-3 years, actually. And it's even worse than not, complaining and then not doing anything about it. What they did was they took Tulsi's bill, which was a brilliant bill, offering open source blockchain software, funding the states to make sure it can be uniform, automatic audits, automatic hand count and paper ballots, in addition to the open source blockchain software. And they instead, while she was in the Miami debate, preparing for that, the day before the debate itself, while she was actually in Miami, they introduced a fake version of her bill, which was basically it was just a bunch of pork for Democrats. It was going to actually monopolize the voting system and make sure that that only basically U.S. private corporations could be involved in the creation of voting machines and software. So it's even worse than not caring about it, but they deliberately were about to make it worse. And so I agree that they both want to get away with cheating. And you have to remember there's a residual impact that happens whenever the federal government passes a law, Democrat or Republican, and then you have to now, because you voted yes or no on it, you have to deal with the Democrats and Republicans in your own state who are relying on being able to cheat their opponents until you flip that system on its head. So you not only have to worry about your colleagues in D.C., but then you have to worry about your partisan colleagues back at home. And if you lose them, then you might not win your next race. They could decide not to endorse you. they can remove your funding or help to finance another candidate who is less, who showed less concern about the election system and just worried about playing the game so they get their office. Because I think that if we've proved anything, regardless of what you think about the outcome of the election, if you believe it was stolen, if you don't think it was stolen, whatever, we do know this. We'll never know who actually won. We really won't. And that in and of itself is, in my opinion, is criminal. We don't have a democracy at that point. And the reason both parties perpetuate and propagate this problem and then want to pretend like last minute, right, like Donald Trump did, oh my God, we didn't know that voting machines were an issue, even though they've been around for 4 years. Like, you knew this was a problem before you ran. You could have put pressure on Congress to introduce election integrity legislation. You chose not to. So in my opinion, at that point, you're no better than the Democrats.
Yeah, in a couple of ways, I don't think we have a democracy at this point. And arguably, we haven't had one for a little while. And it's not just our electoral systems. It's also simply the fact that, I'll put it like this: in 2016, the election in general, not the way that the election was executed, but its result was invalidated in spirit by Democrats based on these wild accusations of Russian influence that were never borne out. And now, of course, in 2020, you have all of the right wing, pretty much, as far as I can tell, either roundly suspicious or directly condemning the Biden administration for what they saw as overthrowing the results of the election in their favor. We're never going to get that back. I really don't think so. I think it's going to get worse in 2024, 2028, not to mention the midterms. Nico, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate the conversation.
A great conversation. For those listening, that was the voice of Nico House, political activist, broadcast journalist, and the founder and CEO of the MCSC Network. You can follow Nico on Twitter at NicoCSFB. Follow the Mikasa Sukasa Network on Twitter at MCSC Network, and watch their videos on YouTube by searching for MCSC Network with Nico House. We're going into a break, but we'll be back in just a minute taking calls, 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
Great shot. Even better. Let's get one more, just to be sure.
Are you a young photographer the world needs to know? Bring your images to more eyes through the Andre Stenin contest. Open to both artists and photojournalists, there are dozens of categories to enter and compete for a share of serious prize money. And, more importantly, international recognition of your work. Learn more about how to enter at stenincontest.com. Point, shoot, win.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're taking calls. 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. That's the first time I heard that ad. I think that's a new ad that just played. Cool. Anyway, we're taking calls, 202-521-1320. We have Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's going on, man?
Good morning. I have two comments. Okay, my first comment is this. Because I'm a whistleblower and I'm a dissident, right? I voice my opinion, and the Patriot 2 Act is coming out. This is what I have to do to protect myself. That little gun I have, I'm going to pawn that sucker. You know what I'm saying? Because, you got new sheriffs in town. They ain't playing. So that's something I have to do. My second comment is the most important one. Trump can still turn this around for Julian Assange, believe it or not, even though he didn't point him and the other whistleblowers, right? That's what he have to do. He need to get in front of the camera because they're still going after him anyway, right? He have to get in front of the camera and say this: look, I made a mistake. I listened to the wrong people, and I should have pardoned Julian Assange. And I realized that I made a mistake, and y'all please forgive me. And I need y'all to do me a favor, the mega crowd and the leftists. I need y'all to write to congressmen and senators, asking them to ask the DOJ to drop the charges against Julian Assange. This will create an uproar, right? A leverage for Ryan Paul and Massey and the others that's pro freedom on the speech to have a Senate trial, Congress trial where they can debate this, right? Now I don't know if they have powers to get the DOJ to drop the charge, but this will bring so much attention around Julian Assange and Snowden and others that I think Julian Assange will become a politically hot ball because now a hot potato. Excuse me. I mean, Now a lot of people know it, and Trump uses his platform, even though he's been banned, that now you got popular support now to basically drop the charges against Julian Assange. Trump can't do this. And I think they probably could have Senate hearings on this one, on where Ryan Paul can debate this. You know,
but he's not gonna. Trump is not gonna do that. First of all, Trump is not gonna admit that he made a major mistake. I just don't see that ever happening. Maybe like in private to a loved one, possibly, but certainly not in public. And I mean, my personal take here is, Tarif, it is too late for Trump. He's not gonna make that kind of move. If you want Assange pardoned, if you want the charges against him dropped, you're going to have to look probably not at the Biden administration, although maybe, but you're going to have to look somewhere else or for some other means to organize on that one. My personal take is I would just let that one go, but I don't want to completely shut it down. I think there should still be a push there. Jamarl, what's your take?
I agree with you. Trump is out of office, and at this point, Trump is concerned about not going to prison. From the various lawsuits, especially from the standpoint of New York, I don't think Trump is concerned about Assange. And to go further on that, it was the Obama administration that basically decided not to go after Assange. It was the Trump administration that actively decided to pursue Assange. It was the Trump administration that put Chelsea Manning in prison with the idea of getting information or try to get her to knuckle under to go after Assange. So all of this was done under Trump, under the guise of the Russiagate stuff, believing that Assange was somehow assisting Donald Trump and working with the Russians and putting information out about Hillary Clinton. Like, this is what all this was coming from. And Donald Trump, when he was getting rid of the missile treaties, Donald Trump, when he was taking provocative action, like giving weapons to the Ukraine, something that not even Obama would do, it seemed like a lot of the behaviors that Donald Trump was taking was in order to push back against the narrative that he was working with the Russians. And so,
at least in part. At least,
right?
Because
exactly.
He had a Secretary of State. He had Bolton for a time. Right. He had people in his administration who would have pushed for those things anyway.
But
you can argue that
for that
personally,
reason? Like, did he put in did he bring in Bolton specifically for that reason, that he's a Russia hawk? Like, I get the feeling that a lot of Trump's behavior was to push back against the notion that he was a puppet, and that's unfortunate because this was the opportunity for a lessening of hostilities as opposed to more. But I agree with you with the Julian Assange thing. The Trump pardon of Assange, that's over with. Trump is concerned about his own affairs at this point. And like I said, he was the one that went after Assange in the first place. What do you think, Shane? Do you think...
I think we should go to more callers, but I just wanted to say that briefly. Weirdly, I think that Trump had too much faith in the media. Despite him being the candidate who is justifiably complaining about and condemning the fake news media, he thought that they might change their tune if he started to act differently. And I think that is him having way too much faith in how the news media was going to respond to him, whatever he did, frankly. So it's weird. But we have other callers. We got Michael calling in from Sydney. Michael, you're on the line. What's going on?
Yeah, hey guys. Look, I didn't watch Biden's inauguration. I did see some of the clips on TV. It was quite gross, actually. Not that I'm a Trump fan. I mean, he's gross himself. But at least he didn't start any wars. And I think if you have a look at Biden and his speech, really, and his policy in general, really he's lining up Venezuela as the target where he'll start a war. He will start a war with Venezuela. He'll try to anyway. And then he'll probably move on to Cuba. I think basically America has given up on Iran. I mean, he said basically he's going back to the JPOC. And, he basically given up on Iran. They've given up on Syria. They've given up on Afghanistan and Russia and China. And I think they're looking to return back to the Monroe Doctrine and dominate, South America. And I also think, I remember, on the subject of censorship and tyranny and insurrection, I think it was Jefferson or one of the founding fathers over there who said something like about when the government becomes tyrannical, revolution becomes your patriotic duty. I'm not wrong.
Yeah, well, it's your paraphrase, kind of. It's that it becomes an absolute, and it's not just a necessity, but a reality. Meaning, it's if you don't have the capacity to change your government, to reform, to actual real structural reforms in order to make things better, because the environment changes, right? Like there's no such thing as a constant in regards to the way our time. There's always changes, and your government needs to be able to accommodate and adjust those changes. I think part of
that was Jefferson.
Yeah, and the point was
that was Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, if you make revolution, or if you make it necessary, you make it an actuality. You make it something that is going to absolutely happen. Sydney, before you leave, Michael, the bill or the law that they were talking about the Google and the Facebook thing, what are they saying in the media about that? We don't have a huge amount of time because we have other callers. But what is the argument in the conversation in the press?
I don't watch. I don't watch much corporate media. I watch some of the state media over here. Just to have a bit of a laugh and see what they're up to. But yeah, basically, it's been mentioned, and then people are, I think, at the end of the day, it's a bit of a bluff. I mean, if you take down Google over here, it'll just force us to use, Huawei and use their operating system and their search engines, and it'll just push us to move closer to China if Google were to take down all their services over here, or we'd move to Samsung apps or something like, or Apple apps or whatever. So I think it's we just change search engines, and it'd just be a big loss for them. And yeah.
Thank you for the call, Michael. We have Kevin in Canada. Kevin, what's going on?
Hey, guys. It's me again, the guy with the idea about chanting or protesting Medicare for all towards Biden every Friday.
Of course. Definitely remember. You called in the last 2 days about it. Yeah, go for it, Kevin. What's in your mind, man?
Okay, well, Jamarl mentioned something about consequences, and it's a good point. And I would say the 3 consequences, and 4 consequences actually, is how much attention this would bring to the issue. And if there's hundreds of thousands or millions of people chanting every Friday towards Biden, saying, demanding Medicare for all Congress is going to see that. And that's going to scare the shit out of them. Number 2.
You can't say that on the air. Kevin. Just real quick note, you can't curse on the radio.
Oh, sorry. Scare the crap
You're
out
good.
of them. Sorry. And the next thing, the next point is it shows a force of unity. It shows that we can all work together to create and make something happen. And if there's millions of people demanding Medicare for all, that's going to inspire a lot of people to take up the Medicare for all when they're running for office. And
that is the big if, though. That is the big if. That's the big question, is whether you can actually get that widespread support. Now, there's certainly room for it, I would say. Like, you can see with Bernie Sanders, and you can see from the polling, but you can see with the support for Bernie Sanders specifically that, there's massive support. A lot of people are willing to support a politician who himself supports Medicare for all, or at least something approaching that, but really the thing in itself. So there's definitely room for it, but whether you can form a cohesive enough movement on social media to get enough people to call for it, that's another question. And if you want to do that, either you particularly or anybody, that's organizing work that needs to be done on the back end, and probably a lot of work, but it's possible. But it is a big if. Anyway, Kevin, you were saying.
Will actually work, because if all the like Jamarl and Kyle and Mike and David all do this, it will trend. And if it happens and recurs every Friday, it will just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think it would get into millions of people. And I think it wouldn't stop.
One thing is, here's the thing. This is actually from Saul Alinsky, the book Rules for Radicals. And it's not a new concept. He's not the originator of it. But you need variety. You don't just need consistency, but you need one of the tactics is you need to have different ways to make it exciting. So in other words, if it's every Friday, like I'll put it like this, there have been consistent vigils for Assange. Now I think those have helped to hold that movement together, but if consistency were all it took, he would be free by now, because there has been a very consistent crowd of his supporters. I'm not trying to make an example of them or criticize them, really. Just saying, you need variety as well. You don't just need consistency. You need something exciting, something that can bring people back into it. That's my take. We got another caller, and I think we should go to him. Kevin, thank you so much for the call, and thank you for thank you for your consistency in pushing for this. We got Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on the line. What's going on, man?
Hey, what's up, guys? There's not nearly enough time for me to say what I want to say and ask what I want to ask, or ride this petty path and really lean into Nico's segment. So what I will ask is maybe next week, if you guys could, elaborate a little bit on your perspectives on the Washington Capitol, I guess somewhat insurrection or whatever we want to call it at the time, based off of the information that was introduced in that segment by Nico. And then I would like to say, if I could, to that last caller, you know what you really need to do is just take action. Like you can keep on running your ideas to everybody and getting everybody's opinion, but the best thing to do is just start and let the idea grow, and you can fix it and you can tune it. But the best thing anyone can do in any situation is take action. And I'll leave it there. Just say have a good weekend, everybody.
Hey, you too, Brave. And thank you for that. Thank you for the words of encouragement to Kevin. And he's right. You know what? For those listening, for Kevin, he's right. Thank you, everybody, for listening to us this week. I hope you all have a great week. Happy belated MLK Jr. Day. Just wanted to round that off, and I hope you all have a great weekend. Thank you to our guests today. Thank you to producers Cameron and Raheem. Thank you to our audio engineer, Andre. And thank you, Jamarl Thomas, for being here with me hosting this show. And again, thank you, that is you, for listening to us. I hope you all have a great weekend. Signing off, Fault Lines with Thomas in Stranahan.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one is in the record books. Shout out to Shane. Shout out to engineers and everybody else that makes the show possible. And of course, shout out to you guys. Let's see. Rev Barker. Sorry if you covered it earlier. I'm on the West Coast. Less than 24 hours is what it took for more troops back in Syria and considering in Iraq. Yeah. So Nico hit on this a little bit. I don't think we covered this one in our headlines. But yeah, it took one day. To get the troop increase in Syria. And if I'm not mistaken, I thought the troop increase was also sent to Iraq, but I need to make sure. I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, it didn't take long, did it? It did not take long. And for all of these people voting for Biden, you voted for this. I mean, if you're going to put Biden in office without any concessions, without any expectations and requirements of him because you're so terrified of Donald Trump, then you vote and you get what you get. My mother got caught. Oh, right. I've read that one. So Rev Barker. Yeah, that's all it took. One day. And this is one of those main things that Donald Trump was actually relatively good on. Don't misunderstand me. And I'm saying relatively because he was still pretty ghastly. Donald Trump increased the number of assassinations that were taking place because he made sure that stuff was in the black. Obama modestly brought a little bit out of the black despite the thousands of people that he had killed as civilians. But Donald Trump basically kept that stuff cloak and dagger. And so, it's like, no, he didn't necessarily start any wars. Yes, he could have sleptwalked into a war, either in Venezuela or, for that matter, Iran. And many of the situations that Donald Trump got this country into, there would have been no way to extricate it right off the bat. Meaning, at the point where you murder Soleimani, well, at the point where Iran responds, what are you going to do with their response? And do you let their response go through? And depending on the severity of their response, can you let their response pass? It's a tit for tat that escalates into a war where the side that basically starts it doesn't acknowledge that they started it, nor does the media hold that side to account for starting it. And the reality of it is that Joe Biden is basically going to go back to the mainstream norm. And that is coups, that is troops in other countries that don't belong to us. That's probably an Asian pivot against China. And yeah, the howler monkeys in the party that scream Russia, Russia, Russia at every opportunity. Or the howler monkeys that scream Donald Trump is synonymous with Joseph Stalin. It's ludicrous and utterly ridiculous. Must come for the press, people. I think that's what they said. Jamarl, please do more shows. Nico, you too. Two are great on the same show. I would love to do more shows, and I try to. Recently, this year has been last year has just been rough, man. Between family members passing, between my own illness, yeah, that's been rough. But all things being equal, yes, the goal is to try to get more shows in. Trudy, could you guys do just one more show a week with calls from regular viewers only? Interesting. Tired of Kim, Nico, and other names doing all of the talking. Or is it just me? That's funny. Can you guys do a show once a week with just the regular viewers only? Tired of Nico, Kim, and other names doing all of the talking? Or is it just me? Well, Trudy, it's a talk show. I think your issue, Trudy, is that I need to do more shows. I think that's what it boils down to. And like I said, recently with illness and everything else, that hasn't necessarily been the easiest thing to do. But I feel you, Trudy. I think the thing is, it's a talk show. And as a talk show, we bring people on to talk. And so there are going to be people who are on all sides of the political distribution when we have those conversations. Let me think about that, Trudy. Let me think about that. Maybe the way to do it is to... Yeah, I need to think about that. I need to figure out how to pull that off. Because, when I first started Patreon, the original idea was, okay, we're going to have a show a week where Patreons get to add their say-so and add their topics. And then what we realized was that by putting a topic on Patreon, nobody sees it. So you might get like 40 views, 100 views, because you have a limited number of people on Patreon to be able to see the video. So if you put out a question and that question is limited from the number of people who can view it, does it get people the bang for the buck and allowing other people to see the question itself? I think the question goes beyond the individual question being answered. I think it also goes to this idea that they want other people to hear the answer to that question. And so we ended up having this kind of weird thing of, okay, how do we have a thing just for people who contribute? Well, there was no way to do it, at least not under the YouTube model, because many other platforms didn't allow video in the moment where you can isolate it to the number of people. I suppose you could send out an unlisted site, but I don't know if that gives you the bang for your buck. But Trudy, let me think about it. There was talk about it behind the scenes for doing a potentially secondary episode, but I'll see. I think what needs to happen, Trudy, is that I just open up for phone calls on like a show a week or something like that. Have a contributor appreciation and just have phone calls also. Maybe that's the way to do it. Yeah, let me think about it. All right, I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I'm going to say subscribe. I want to thank all of you for the comments. And Trudy, here are my thoughts. Yeah, here are my thoughts. The thing with the contributor appreciation over the past several months, this past few months have been very strange. You guys probably have seen my arm, the difference between the two. I've heard some people basically mention either in the chat or in the comments, what the fuck is wrong with this arm? Well, a lot of that goes to the medical issues that have been taking place. A lot of you know that I'm on dialysis. I do treatments. And I know some people will be like, wait a minute, how the hell was he traveling on dialysis? Yes, that was a difficult thing to pull off, but I did it. When my fistula stopped working, they had to put a catheter in. When they put a catheter in, everything was fine. It was a pain in the ass, but they put another fistula in, and that's when all hell broke loose. And my arm basically blew up 3 sizes too big. Painful, uncomfortable, etc. And it has been this way for the past, 5 months now. Doing the show and trying to do the show with the medical issues, either the partial blindness, the stroke, all of that stuff took place like in the last 4 months. And so it was like a lot of stuff that's been going on. I think what you guys are asking basically is just do more shows. And as things kind of peter out to a certain degree of normality going into the year, there will be additional and regular shows. The arm thing, I have no idea how long that's going to last. And the medical stuff associated with it, I have no idea how long that's going to last. But by the same token, I still have been pulling off shows while also doing Sputnik and attending to the other stuff. So even though the intensity might have gone down on some of the days, meaning it's not 6 days a week, you still get more, and there will be more coming. So that's basically what's been going on behind the scenes. It's been a rough several months. So I'll leave it here. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I'm going to say subscribe. And I want to thank all of you for joining us once again. You'll see me later today.